Ruth Beiler drove the shovel into frozen ground with both hands alone, while every man in the Amish settlement watched from the fence and did nothing. Her father lay in a pine box behind her. No one had come to help carry it. No one had spoken her name in 7 days. She dug until her palms bled, and her breath came in ragged clouds against the winter air. And that was the moment Elias Croft stepped off his horse. Walked past every watching man, took the shovel from her bleeding hands, and said, "Nobody buries their father alone, not while I'm standing." Taha. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow Ruth and Elias all the way to the end. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Beiler farm sat at the eastern edge of the Lancaster settlement, Pennsylvania winter of 1879, where the wind came off the hills like a judgment, and the ground stayed hard from October until April. Ruth Beiler had lived her entire 24 years on that land, born in the back bedroom, schooled at the kitchen table, baptized in the creek that ran behind the barn. And she had loved every inch of it, the way a person only loves the place they have never been allowed to leave. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. Even as a girl, she had been broad-shouldered, heavy-hipped, built in a way that the other women of the settlement described in low voices as unfortunate. By the time she was 16, the whispers had hardened into something crueler. By the time she was 20, they had become simple fact stated plainly by mothers to their sons. Ruth Beiler is not the kind of woman a man builds a life with. She knew what they said. She had always known. But she had also known her father, Joseph Beiler, believed otherwise. And while he lived, that had been enough. Joseph Beiler died on a Tuesday in his sleep, with his boots standing neatly beside the bedroom door, the way he always left them. Ruth found him at first light when she came to check whether he wanted eggs or porridge for breakfast. She stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. Then she walked to his bedside, folded his hands across his chest, kissed his forehead once, and went to the barn to feed the animals, because the animals still needed feeding. And her father had always said that grief was no excuse to let something innocent go hungry. After the animals were fed, she walked into town. She went first to Bishop Levi Stoltzfus, the man who governed the settlement's spiritual life with the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted himself. She knocked on his door and told him plainly that her father had passed in the night, and she would need help preparing him and digging the grave, as the ground was frozen and she could not do it alone. Bishop Stoltzfus looked at her from his doorway for a moment. He was a large man himself, not in the way Ruth was large, but in the way that authority makes men expand outward, filling rooms and doorframes with their certainty. "Your father's brothers will be notified," he said. "The community will decide how to proceed with the farm." Ruth waited. That was not what she had asked. "I need help burying him," she said again. "Today. The ground is hard." "Sister Ruth," the bishop's voice dropped into the tone he used for correction. "There are matters to be discussed first regarding the property. Your father had no sons. The land—" "My father is lying in his bed," Ruth said. Her voice did not shake. She had spent 24 years keeping her voice from shaking in front of men like this. "He is not a property matter. He is my father, and he deserves to be buried before sundown." The bishop looked at her the way men in his position look at women who speak plainly, as though plainness itself were a form of impropriety. "I will send word to the elders," he said. "We will meet tomorrow." He closed the door. Ruth stood on his porch for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then she turned and walked back home. She went to the barn. She found the heaviest shovel, and she began to dig. The Lancaster settlement in winter was not a cruel place in the obvious sense. The people there did not shout or threaten. Their cruelty was quieter than that. It was the cruelty of averted eyes, of hands kept in pockets when hands were needed, of decisions made in back rooms that determined the shape of a woman's entire life without ever consulting that woman once. By noon, Ruth had dug 8 inches into the earth behind the house where her mother was also buried, where her father had always said he wanted to rest. 8 inches in frozen Pennsylvania ground, with her hands wrapped in rags, with her breath hanging in visible clouds, with the pale winter sun, doing nothing useful overhead. Several men from the settlement walked past the fence that morning. She saw them. They saw her. Not one of them came through the gate. Old Anna Yoder, who had been Ruth's mother's closest friend before Ruth's mother died, stood at the fence for nearly 5 minutes watching Ruth work. Ruth looked up once. Anna Yoder looked away and kept walking. By mid-afternoon, Ruth's palms had blistered, and the blisters had torn open. She wrapped them tighter in the rags and kept going. She had reached perhaps 14 inches. The grave needed to be 4 feet deep. She understood with the calm of someone who has always had to understand practical things without anyone's help that she was not going to make it by sundown. She stopped and leaned on the shovel and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had decided that this morning, standing in her father's doorway, she was going to be useful instead. Useful was something she knew how to be even when no one wanted it. She lifted the shovel again. That was when she heard the horse. Elias Croft was not supposed to be in Lancaster County. He was supposed to be in Virginia delivering a string of horses to a buyer outside Richmond, which was a transaction worth enough money to keep him and his small ranch in western Pennsylvania solvent through another winter. He had ridden east before Christmas, and the deal had fallen through. The buyer had died. The buyer's sons had disputed the estate, and Elias had spent 3 weeks in a legal disagreement that went nowhere. And now he was riding home by way of routes that cost nothing in tolls, which meant back roads, which meant cutting through farming country in the middle of winter with nothing but his own company and a horse named Gideon, who had opinions about everything. He was 41 years old. He was not a man anyone would call soft. He had spent 20 years working cattle in states that did not care whether you survived them. And he carried that history in the set of his jaw and the way he occupied space, quietly but completely, the way a stone occupies a riverbed. He had been married once, 7 years ago. His wife Margaret had died of fever in the summer of 1872, and he had buried her in the high meadow behind the ranch where she had liked to watch the sun go down. After that, he had sold most of the cattle kept enough to justify the land, and largely stopped expecting anything from the future. He was not a bitter man. He had specifically decided after Margaret died that he was not going to become a bitter man. But he had become a quiet one, and quietness in a man of his size and history was something most people read as warning and kept their distance from accordingly. He came around the eastern edge of the Beiler property at roughly 3 in the afternoon, following the fence line toward the road that would eventually take him north. He was not looking for anything. He was looking at the road. Then he heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not crying or screaming. It was the sound of a shovel striking frozen ground, a dull, determined, repeated impact, and underneath that sound, barely audible, the sound of someone breathing with the particular effort of someone who has been working beyond their strength and has decided not to stop anyway. He pulled Gideon up. Over the fence, he saw a woman standing in a half-dug grave, shoulders wide, dark dress, dusty with frozen earth hands, wrapped in bloody rags, driving a shovel into ground that clearly did not want to be moved. She was alone. There was no one else in the yard. There was a farmhouse 20 yards away with a dark window, and behind that window from this angle he could just make out the shape of a pine box laid across 2 sawhorses. Elias Croft had seen a great many things in his life. He had seen cattle drives collapse in bad weather. He had seen men cheat other men out of everything they owned and sleep fine afterward. He had seen grief in all its different shapes. He had never seen a woman burying her father alone while other people walked past the fence. He dismounted. He tied Gideon to the fence post. He unlatched the gate and walked through it. Ruth heard the footsteps and looked up. She did not know this man. He was tall, taller than most men she had encountered, with a dark coat and a hat pulled low against the cold, and the kind of face that had been weathered past the point where age showed clearly. He was looking at her the way she was not accustomed to being looked at, which was to say, directly and without flinching, and without the small rearrangement of expression that most people performed when they first registered her size. He looked at her the way a man looks at another person. That was all. She did not know what to do with that. "Nobody buries their father alone," he said. "Not while I'm standing." He held out his hand for the shovel. Ruth looked at his hand, then at his face. She had learned over 24 years to be careful about accepting help from strangers, because help from strangers in a closed community was almost always help that came attached to something. "I don't know you," she said. "Elias Croft. I'm passing through." He kept his hand out. "Who's in the box?" "My father." Her voice was steady. "Joseph Beiler." "How long have you been out here?" "Since this morning." Something moved in his expression. Not pity, she knew what pity looked like, and she didn't want it. This was something different. Something closer to recognition. "Go wrap those hands properly," he said. "I'll dig." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." He looked at her without apology. "Go wrap your hands, Miss Beiler. The ground's not getting softer." Ruth looked at him for one more moment. Then she handed him the shovel and walked to the house. He dug for 3 hours. Ruth came back with her hands properly bandaged and stood nearby, not hovering. Being something she had a great deal of practice at, being present without demanding anything. Being useful without insisting on it. She brought him water when he needed it. She checked on the animals. She moved her father's Bible from the bedroom to the sitting room and sat for a while reading the passages he had loved. When the grave was the right depth, Elias climbed out and stood beside it. He did not say anything. He took off his hat. Ruth said, "I need help carrying him." "Yes, ma'am." They carried Joseph Beiler out together. Ruth at the feet, Elias at the shoulders, and they laid him down properly. And Ruth said the prayers her father had said every night of her life, the ones in Pennsylvania Dutch that she had learned before she had learned English. And Elias stood with his hat in his hands and bowed his head, and did not say a word through any of it, which was the only right thing to do. And also she realized something most people would not have known, after they filled in the grave together. It was nearly dark when they finished. The temperature had dropped sharply as the sun went down, the way it does in Pennsylvania in January, with a seriousness that reminds you that the cold is not finished with you and was never particularly interested in your schedule. Ruth stood at the grave for a moment. Then she turned to Elias Croft. "Thank you," she said. "It was right to do." Not everyone agreed with that today. He looked at the fence at the road beyond it, where there were no longer any watching men, because the watching men had gone home to their warm houses and their wives and their comfortable confidence that they had not done anything wrong. His jaw tightened very slightly. "No," he said. "I suppose not." Ruth hugged her arms around herself against the cold. She should have offered him supper. Her father would have expected her to offer supper, but everything in her had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet after grief runs up against practicality for an entire day and leaves a person with nothing left in reserve. "You'll need somewhere to sleep," she said instead. "It's too cold to make the North Road tonight. There's a barn, clean hay, stove in the tack room I can get burning." He looked at her. That same direct, uncomplicated look. "I don't want to put you out, Miss Beiler." "You dug my father's grave," she said. "You can sleep in the barn." He stayed 3 days, not because she asked him to, and not because he pushed himself where he wasn't wanted, but because the morning after the burial, Bishop Stoltzfus arrived at the farm with 2 of the settlement elders and a man Ruth had never seen before, who turned out to be a land clerk from the county seat. And the 4 of them stood in her kitchen and told her that under the laws of the Lancaster settlement, with no male heir, the Beiler farm would pass to her father's nearest male relative, her Uncle Daniel, who lived 40 miles east and had visited the farm exactly twice in Ruth's life, both times to borrow money. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to this. "The community will ensure you are cared for," Bishop Stoltzfus said. He meant it kindly. She understood that he meant it kindly. There was a particular kind of man who could take everything from a woman and mean it kindly, and the bishop was that kind of man. "There are families who would welcome your help. The Yoder household, the Millers." "As hired help," Ruth said. "As a member of the community in service." "As hired help," Ruth said again. "That's what you mean." The bishop's expression went the way it went when she spoke plainly. "Ruth, my father built this farm. I have worked it every day of my life. He intended it to pass to me. He had no sons. He had me. That is not how the law—" "Which law?" She looked at the land clerk. "Pennsylvania state law or the settlements law?" The land clerk shifted in his chair. He was a younger man, perhaps 30, with the expression of someone who had not expected his Tuesday to go this way. "The property deed is in your father's name, Miss Beiler, without a will specifying. My father told me this farm was mine. Verbally. Every day of my life." "I'm sorry," the clerk said, and she believed that he was in a limited way sorry. "Without documentation." That was when Elias Croft came through the back door. He had been in the barn. He had no reason to know any of this was happening, but he had heard voices that sounded like the kind of voices that precede decisions being made without someone's consent, and he had come in. He stood inside the back door, filling it the way he filled spaces quietly, completely, with the particular authority of a man who has never needed to announce himself. He looked at the bishop, at the elders, at the land clerk, then at Ruth. "Everything all right, Miss Beiler?" he said. Bishop Stoltzfus turned. He had not known anyone else was on the property. His eyes moved over Elias with the quick assessment of a man recalibrating. "This is a private matter of the community," the bishop said. "I expect it is," Elias said. He did not move from the doorway. "What kind of matter?" "This farm," Ruth said, because she was not going to stand in her own kitchen and let men speak for her, "belongs to me. These men are here to inform me that it doesn't." Elias looked at the clerk. "The deed's in the father's name." "It is," the clerk said, "and the father's dead." "Since Tuesday." Elias looked at Ruth. "Did your father write a will?" "He couldn't write," Ruth said. "Not well. He always meant to have someone help him. He always said he'd get to it." Her voice didn't waver. She would not let it waver. "He didn't get to it." Something shifted in Elias's expression. The particular shift of a man who has watched people be wronged enough times to recognize exactly what he was looking at. "There a lawyer in the county seat?" he asked the clerk. "There are two." "Then nothing's decided yet." He looked at the bishop with a calm that was Ruth noticed considerably more unsettling than anger would have been. "The woman just buried her father 2 days ago. Any decisions about this property can wait until she has time to understand her legal options. The laws of the settlement are not the laws of Pennsylvania," Elias said, "and Pennsylvania law is what's written on that deed." The bishop looked at Elias for a long moment. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes, the particular calculation of a man deciding how much weight this stranger carries, and whether it's worth the confrontation. "And who are you," the bishop said carefully, "to speak to settlement matters?" Elias Croft looked at him. Then he looked at Ruth, and something happened in the 3 seconds of silence that followed that Ruth would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. It was not dramatic. He did not make a speech. He did not threaten or posture. He simply looked at Ruth with the direct, uncomplicated attention he had shown her from the moment he walked through her gate, and then he looked back at the bishop and he said, "I'm the man who's been working this farm for 3 days, and I expect I'll keep working it until Miss Beiler decides what she wants to do with it." The bishop opened his mouth, then closed it. The two elders exchanged a glance. The land clerk looked at his papers. "We'll return when matters are clearer," Bishop Stoltzfus said finally, and the 4 of them left. Ruth stood in her kitchen after they were gone and did not move for a long time. Then she turned to Elias Croft, who was still in the doorway, who had not moved either, who was watching her with that same unreadable patience. "You don't have to do that," she said. "What?" "Stay. Say those things. You have somewhere to be. You said you had somewhere to be." "I do," he said. "I'll get there." "Mr. Croft?" "Elias." She looked at him. "Elias, I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm not—" She stopped. She didn't know how to finish that sentence because she didn't know what she was trying to say. She was not helpless. She was not a charity case. She was not the kind of woman who needed a man to walk through doors and change things. She had never been that kind of woman, and she did not intend to become one. But she was also standing in a kitchen that was going to stop being hers by the end of the month, if no one helped her, and she had no money for lawyers, and her father was 2 days buried, and her hands were still bandaged, and she had not slept more than an hour and a half since finding him Tuesday morning. "I don't know what you think is happening," she said again. Elias crossed to the kitchen table and pulled out a chair and sat down in it, unhurried with the ease of a man who moves through the world at his own pace and doesn't particularly care if the world objects. "Your father had land," he said. "You worked it. He meant it to go to you. Some men in suits want to give it to someone who didn't work it." He looked at her. "Is that about right?" "That's about right." "Then what's happening," he said, "is that you need to fight for it. And fighting takes time, and time costs money, and money you don't have." He clasped his hands on the table. "So." Ruth looked at him for a long time. "So," she said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Croft?" "Elias." He held her gaze. "I got delayed money coming from a deal that fell through in Virginia. Not much, but enough to cover a lawyer's consultation. And I got time between now and when I need to be anywhere else." He paused. "I'm not proposing charity, Miss Beiler. I'm proposing you let me be useful while I'm here, and you figure out your next move from a position that isn't running out of hours." She studied him, this stranger who had walked through her gate 3 days ago and hadn't left. "Why?" she said, not accusing, genuinely asking. He thought about that. "Because you drove that shovel into frozen ground for 6 hours," he said, "and not one man from your own community came through the gate." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "Some things just sit wrong with me." That sat wrong. Ruth's hands tightened in her lap. She had been alone with her grief and her fury for 3 days, and she was very good at carrying those things. She had been carrying them her entire life, and she was not accustomed to someone naming them plainly in her own kitchen and looking at her as though she had every right to feel them. "I'll make supper," she said finally, "and then we'll talk about what needs doing on this farm before the ground freezes any deeper." Elias Croft nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. What followed was 12 days of work. Elias did not talk much. Ruth discovered that she did not mind this. She had grown up in a community where silence was either approval or condemnation, and she had spent her whole life learning to read which one it was. Elias Croft's silence was neither of those things. It was simply silence, the quiet of a man who was present without needing to fill the air. He fixed the fence along the north field that had been weakening since October. He checked the integrity of the barn roof before the next snow came. He was good with her horse, a difficult older mare named Persistent, who did not trust strangers, who within 4 days was walking to Elias at the fence line and standing quietly while he checked her shoes. Ruth watched this and did not say anything about it, but she noticed. She took stock of the farm's finances and shared them with him plainly, the way she would have done with a business partner, because she was not going to perform helplessness. She didn't feel just because the situation was hard. The numbers were not good. 3 seasons of adequate harvests, but the winter supplies were lower than they should have been because her father's health had been declining for 2 years, and she had spent money on medicine that should have gone to reserves. The farm could survive another year if nothing else went wrong, which in her experience was not how things tended to go. "You know farming?" she asked him one evening. "Some." He was carving something, a simple repair to a harness buckle that would have cost money to replace. "Cattle mostly, some crops. I ran a proper operation once." "What happened to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died," he said. "I cut it back." Ruth looked at the fire. "How long ago?" 7 years. She nodded. She did not offer condolences. He was 7 years past needing condolences, and she had the sense that he was a man who would find them embarrassing at this point. Instead, she said, "What would you do with it now if you were going to run it again?" He looked at her. "The ranch," he said. The ranch. She folded her hands. You said you cut it back after your wife died. That suggests you didn't sell it entirely. That means it's still there. And if it's still there, he said slowly. 40 miles west. Small, good land. So what would you do with it, she said, if you decided to? He was quiet for a long time, turning the harness piece in his hands. I'd build it back, he said finally. The way she wanted it. She had a plan for the south pasture we never got to. He paused. She was the one with the plan. I was the one with the hands. Ruth said nothing. Elias looked at her. Why are you asking me this? Because, Ruth said carefully, I've been thinking about what happens if the lawyer says I can't keep this farm. And I've been thinking that I have skills, farm management, animal supplies, growing things, and that there are ranches in this state where those skills would be useful, and that... She stopped. Elias waited. I don't know exactly what I'm saying, she said, except that I'm not going to be someone's hired help in my own community, while my father's farm gets given to a man who visited twice. I would rather be useful somewhere else entirely. Elias Croft set down the harness piece. He looked at Ruth Beiler across the firelight of her father's kitchen. This woman he had known for 12 days, who had driven a shovel into frozen ground alone, who had stood in front of a bishop and 2 elders and spoken plainly, who had shared her financial numbers with him like a business partner, who had asked him about his dead wife's plans for the south pasture, with the direct, careful intelligence of someone who was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He picked up the harness piece again. Let's see what the lawyer says first, he said. Yes, Ruth agreed. Let's see what the lawyer says first. But something had shifted in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. The lawyer's name was Thomas Adler. He was 60 years old and had been practicing in Lancaster County for 35 years and had seen in that time enough women lose property they should have kept to find it personally offensive when it happened. He listened to Ruth for 45 minutes. He reviewed what documentation existed. He asked 4 questions, all of which she answered precisely. Then he looked at Elias, who had come along for the reason that in 1879, a woman presenting a loan to a lawyer carried half the weight she carried with a man beside her, and this was a thing Ruth had stated with flat pragmatism in the wagon on the way in. The settlement's claim is based on their own internal laws, Adler said, which do not supersede state law and which have never been successfully enforced against a deeded property in a Pennsylvania court. He paused. However, without a will and without documented evidence of your father's stated intention, the legal process will take time and money. How much of each? Ruth asked. He told her. Ruth looked at the figure he wrote down. She did not let her expression change. She looked at it for a moment, and then she said, What if I married? Adler looked up. A married woman's property rights are, he began, are established more clearly than an unmarried daughter's, Ruth said. I know, I've been reading. She looked at him. If I were married to a man who could demonstrate established intent to farm the property, the settlement's claim becomes considerably harder to press. There was a silence. That's correct, Adler said slowly. Ruth did not look at Elias. She kept her eyes on the lawyer. Elias, for his part, was very still. I'm not saying that's what I'll do, Ruth said. I'm saying I want to understand all of my options. That is one of them, Adler confirmed. He closed his folder. I'd recommend we begin a formal filing regardless. It establishes a record. But Miss Beiler... He looked at her with the directness of a man who has been practicing long enough to say hard things plainly. Your community will not make this easy, and the process will take longer than you likely have financially. Ruth nodded once. Thank you, she said. In the wagon on the way back, she and Elias didn't speak for the first mile. The horse moved steadily through the cold afternoon, and the road was empty, and the sky was the flat white-gray of Pennsylvania in January. Then Elias said, Ruth. She looked at him. He was watching the road. His hands were easy on the reins. He had the kind of hands that always looked easy, whatever they were doing. You said all your options, he said. Not that you wanted that one. No, she agreed. I said I wanted to understand it. There's a difference. Yes. He was quiet for another half a mile. I have 40 acres in western Pennsylvania, he said. Good land, needs work. My wife had a plan for it that I never finished. He paused. I'm 41 years old, and I've been riding from place to place for 7 years, accomplishing not much that matters. Ruth waited. I'm not a romantic man, Elias said. I'm not going to tell you things I can't mean. I will tell you that you're the most capable person I have met in a very long time, and that I believe you would know what to do with 40 acres the same way you know what to do with everything else, and that... He stopped. He seemed for the first time slightly uncertain of his footing. I'm not doing this well. You're doing it clearly, Ruth said, which I prefer. He looked at her then. I need someone with sense, he said. You need someone standing beside you. Neither of us needs to pretend it's anything it isn't yet, but it could. He looked back at the road. It could become something, with time. Ruth looked at the gray sky above the bare trees. She thought about her father, who had said to her once when she was 17 and crying quietly in the barn, about a boy who had laughed at her at church. Ruth, there are men in this world who see what's in front of them, and men who only see what they expect to see. You wait for the first kind. And she had been waiting ever since, with the stubborn patience of a woman who believes somewhere under everything that her father was right. Your ranch, she said. Tell me about the South pasture. And Elias Croft, who had not talked about his land, or his plans, or his dead wife's dreams to another person, in 7 years, began to talk. He talked for the rest of the drive home. They rode back to the Beiler farm in the last gray light of the afternoon, and Ruth spent that evening sitting at her father's kitchen table with a piece of paper writing down numbers, the way her father had taught her every debt, every asset, every possibility, because her father had believed that a problem written down was half a problem solved, and she had never found a reason to disagree with him. Elias slept in the barn. She had offered him the spare room 3 days ago, and he had declined with the simple explanation that the barn was fine and he'd slept in worse, which she believed. She sat with her numbers until nearly midnight. Then she folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket, and went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about what Elias Croft had said in the wagon, and what she had said, and what neither of them had said, and she thought about the South pasture. He had described the creek running along the western edge, the natural windbreak of old oaks, the soil he had tested once and found good, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the bishop's face when Elias had stood in the back doorway, and she thought about Thomas Adler writing a figure on a piece of paper that she did not have. By 4 in the morning, she had made her decision. She was not going to be run off her father's land by men who had never once broken their backs working it. But she was also not going to pretend that she could fight a legal battle alone with no money against a community that had been making women's decisions for them for 100 years. She was going to be practical. Her father had always said that being practical was not the same as giving up. It was the opposite of giving up. It was deciding that you were going to survive no matter what shape the surviving had to take. She got up before dawn and started the stove. When Elias came in from the barn an hour later, she was already at the table with coffee made and the folded paper in front of her. He looked at her. He looked at the paper. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her without being asked. I've been thinking, she said. I know, he said. You've got the look of someone who's been up since 2. 4. Close enough. He wrapped both hands around the cup. What did you decide? Ruth looked at him steadily. I want to be plain about what I'm asking and what I'm not asking. I'm not asking for rescue. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a partnership between 2 people who are both in a position where a partnership makes practical sense. All right, he said. If we married, she said, and she watched his face when she said it, watching for the flinch, for the recalculation, for any of the dozen expressions she had learned to read when men realized that Ruth Beiler was involving herself in something. I keep the farm through the legal process. Adler says it significantly strengthens the claim. And you have someone with actual management sense helping you rebuild a ranch you've been neglecting for 7 years. Elias said nothing. In return, she continued, you get 40 acres with running water and good soil restored to what your wife planned, and someone who will work beside you without complaint and without needing to be told twice. She paused. I am not a romantic woman, Elias. I know what I am and what I'm not, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I am loyal. I am hardworking, and I keep my word. She placed her hands flat on the table. What I'm asking is whether you're a man who can see past what I look like long enough to understand what I'm offering. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the wind outside pressing against the eaves. Elias Croft looked at her for a long time. Not the way men usually looked at her, not the assessment, not the quick downward glance that measured and dismissed, not the careful neutral expression people wore when they wanted to be polite about their disappointment. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the moment he came through the gate, directly, completely, without flinching. I heard you the first time, he said, when you said you weren't a romantic woman. I want to say something back. Say it. I didn't come through that gate because you needed rescue, he said. I came through because what was happening was wrong and I was standing there. Those are different things. He set down his cup. And I didn't stay 12 days because I felt sorry for you. I stayed because you're the most clear-headed person I've been in a room with in a long time, and because... He stopped for a moment. Because this is the first place in 7 years that's felt like something worth being in. Ruth's throat tightened. She didn't let it show. That's a generous thing to say, she said carefully. It's a true thing, he said. Same as everything else I've said to you. He held her gaze. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, Ruth. I don't know how to do that. She believed him. That was the thing she had spent her whole life in a community built on a particular kind of speech, formal and measured and layered with meanings that were never said plainly. And she knew what plain speech felt like when she heard it. And Elias Croft spoke it the way she did, in the way of people who learned early that there was no point in saying things that weren't true, because the world was difficult enough without adding confusion to it. Then yes, she said. If you're asking. I'm asking. She nodded once. He reached across the table and shook her hand. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a practical one. But his hand was warm and steady, and he held hers for 1 moment longer than a handshake required. And Ruth looked at their clasped hands on her father's kitchen table, and something inside her that had been tightly wound for 24 years moved very slightly in the direction of open. She did not say anything about that. She poured more coffee, and they began to plan. They married 4 days later in Thomas Adler's office with Adler's secretary as a witness and a Methodist minister Adler knew who asked no questions about the Amish community and the complications thereof. Ruth wore her best dress and her mother's collar. Elias wore the cleanest shirt he owned. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Walking out of the office afterward, Ruth stopped on the steps and breathed the cold January air and felt something she was not entirely prepared for, which was the particular kind of terrifying lightness that comes when a decision that cannot be undone is made, and the world has not ended, and the next thing simply has to happen. Elias stopped beside her. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. She paused. I don't know what I am. I think I'm all right. Good enough, he said. And then carefully he offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to the wagon. Bishop Stoltzfus found out by the end of the week. Ruth had expected this. Word in a closed community moved the way water moved. It found every crack, every gap, every low place, and it got there faster than anyone expected. She had not announced the marriage, and she had not hidden it, and the result was that by Friday morning, 3 women from the settlement had walked past the farm at intervals she recognized as deliberate, and by Friday afternoon, Bishop Stoltzfus himself was at the door. He was not alone. He brought Elder Mast and Elder Kaufman, the 2 men who had been with him on his first visit, and he brought the particular expression Ruth had last seen on his face in her kitchen, the expression of a man who has decided that patience is warranted but limited. She opened the door before he knocked. "Bishop," she said. He looked at her, then passed her into the kitchen, where Elias was at the table with the farm accounts she had asked him to look over, and where there were 2 coffee cups, and where the spare room door was open and clearly occupied now. The bishop's expression shifted. "I have heard a troubling report," he said. "Come in," Ruth said. He came in. The elders came in. Elias did not stand up, which Ruth noted, and which she understood was deliberate, and which she appreciated for reasons she didn't entirely examine. "You've married a stranger," the bishop said, "without the community's blessing, without the proper time of—" "I've married a man of good character," Ruth said, "under Pennsylvania state law, which is the law that governs this property. Yes." "Ruth." The bishop's voice moved into correction again. "The shunning. I wasn't shunned," she said. "I was tolerated. There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. "You tolerated me while my father was alive because my father had land and labor, and you needed both. When my father died, you moved to take the land within 48 hours of his burial. That is not community. That is management." Elder Mast made a sound. "You speak disrespectfully," Elder Kaufman said. "I speak plainly," Ruth said. "I learned it from my father. He considered it a virtue." The bishop looked at Elias, who had been silent through all of this, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and the farm accounts, looking like a man who has all the time in the world. "Mr. Croft," the bishop said. "Bishop," Elias said, "you have entered into a matter that you do not understand." "I understand land law well enough," Elias said. "And I understand that my wife has legal claim to this property. And I understand that the filing is already in with Adler's office in town." He looked at the bishop without particular hostility. "Which means the conversation about this farm is done. Whatever other matters the community has with Ruth I can't speak to, but the property question is settled." Silence. Elder Mast shifted his weight. Elder Kaufman looked at the floor. Bishop Stoltzfus looked at Ruth for a long moment. "You have chosen the world," he said quietly. "I have chosen not to be managed out of my father's home," Ruth said. "I don't think those are the same thing." The bishop put on his hat. He looked at Ruth with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but occupied an uncomfortable territory between them. "May God guide you," he said. And he left. The elders followed. Ruth closed the door. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, not moving. "Ruth," Elias said. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are." She turned around. He was still at the table watching her with that steady patience, and she thought for a moment about how strange it was to be looked at like that, to be looked at by someone who expected nothing from her expression, who was not waiting for her to fall apart, or to perform strength, who was simply waiting to see what she actually was. "They'll tell everyone I'm shunned now," she said. "Formally. It means—" She breathed in. "It means the people who knew me my whole life won't speak to me, won't sell to me, won't acknowledge me in the road." "I know what it means," he said. She looked at him. "I grew up near a Mennonite community," he said. "I've seen it done." His jaw tightened slightly. "It's a hard thing." "Yes," she said. "It is." She came back to the table and sat down. "Well," she said. She pulled the farm accounts toward her. "There are 3 fence posts on the north field that need replacing before the next snow." Elias looked at her for a moment, then he pulled his coffee cup toward him. "Tell me which ones," he said. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of Ruth's life. Not because they were hard was something she understood. Hard was almost comfortable in its familiarity, but because they were underneath the hard, unexpectedly good. Elias was not an easy man to know. He was not easy in the way that some men were easy, all warmth and ready laughter filling rooms with themselves. He was quiet, and his quietness had texture. It was the quiet of someone listening, which was different from the quiet of someone absent. And Ruth found herself after the first week speaking more than she was accustomed to speaking because something in the quality of his attention made her feel that what she said would be heard. He did not give her compliments. She noticed this and was relieved by it. She had received compliments before from men who said kind things while looking past her. From women who said she had such a pretty face, while meaning she would have been better if she were less, and she had learned to receive them the way she received rain. Something that came from outside herself and had nothing to do with her. Elias did not compliment her. He responded to what she did. When she repaired the harness she'd been putting off for a month, he looked at the repair and said, "That'll hold." When she found the error in his arithmetic on the accounts and corrected it without comment, he came back and said, "You were right. Good eye." These were not compliments. They were acknowledgments. She discovered they were better. He was also, she found, quietly funny. Not in the obvious way, not with stories or jokes, but in the way that he saw things. One morning, the old mare Persistent followed him into the barn and stood directly behind him while he was trying to repair a gate, and he turned around and found her there and said without inflection, "I don't need supervision." And the horse pinned her ears, and Ruth, who had been watching from the door, laughed before she could stop herself. It was the first time she had laughed since her father died. Elias looked at her when she laughed. Something in his expression shifted quick and gone like light moving through a window. He turned back to the gate. "Persistent has opinions," he said. "She always has," Ruth said. "My father named her that for a reason." "I believe it." She stayed in the barn doorway longer than she needed to, and didn't examine why. Go. The shunning landed hard on a Wednesday morning when Ruth walked into the dry goods store in town. Not the settlement store, the county store where anyone could trade, and found herself standing behind two women from the settlement who had known her mother, who turned away from her as though she were not there, who paid for their purchases and left without once acknowledging that she existed. Ruth bought what she needed. She kept her face neutral. She walked out. In the wagon on the way home, she sat very straight and breathed through her nose and thought about her father's face and her mother's collar and the way the dry goods store smelled exactly the way it had smelled when her mother used to bring her there as a girl. And she held all of it together by the deliberate act of will she had been practicing for 24 years, which was the act of not letting the world see the places where it was getting through. She was almost to the farm when she started crying. It was brief and silent. The kind of crying that has been held back too long and doesn't know quite what to do with itself when it's finally allowed. She pressed her hand against her mouth and let it happen, and it was over in 3 minutes, and she wiped her face on her sleeve and drove the wagon into the yard. Elias was at the fence on the north field. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her once, just the once, and something in his face registered what had happened without his expression changing significantly. He came over to help with the horse. "Get everything?" he said. "Yes," she said. He unhitched the wagon. She carried the supplies inside. Neither of them said anything about it. That evening he made supper, which he did occasionally, and not badly, and they ate in their usual working silence. And afterward, when she was washing the dishes, he said from behind her, "The south pasture, the plan my wife had." He paused. She wanted fruit trees along the western edge. Apples, she thought. Said there was no point in a farm if you couldn't grow something that just tasted good. Ruth did not turn around. "That sounds like a person with sense," she said carefully. "She had more than me," he said. "Most ways." Another pause. "I'm not telling you about her because He stopped. Tried again. "I want you to know that I'm not carrying her here like something unfinished. I'm carrying her the way you carry someone you loved who's gone, which is quietly and to the side, and it doesn't leave less room than you'd think." Ruth turned around then. He was looking at her with the direct attention he always gave her, but with something else in it. Now, something careful, something that was costing him something to say. "I'm telling you," he said, "because I want you to know the difference." Ruth held his gaze. "I know the difference," she said. "I lost my father 2 months ago. I understand carrying someone quietly." He nodded. "Apple trees," she said. "On the west edge." That's what she wanted. "That's what we'll plant," Ruth said. come spring. And just like that, without ceremony, something settled between them. Not love, she would not call it that, yet would not be reckless with a word that had always been used by other people to describe things she supposedly couldn't have, but something adjacent to it. Something that was between two people who had decided to trust each other and were finding day by day that the decision held. The legal challenge came faster than Adler had predicted. Ruth's Uncle Daniel arrived on a Saturday in February with two men she didn't know and a county document that had been filed without her knowledge, claiming that Joseph Beiler's property had been verbally promised to Daniel in a private conversation in the fall of 1877, which Daniel was prepared to testify to before a county judge. Ruth read the document twice in the doorway, while Daniel stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who had convinced himself that the thing he was doing was complicated rather than wrong. "Uncle Daniel," she said. "Ruth," he said. "I am sorry for your loss. Your father was—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "You visited twice," she said. "Both times to ask for money. He gave it to you both times." She held up the document. "And now you're telling a judge that he promised you this farm." "Ruth, the settlement has agreed. The settlement doesn't own this farm." Her voice was completely steady. "My father's name is on the deed. Not the settlement's. Not yours. You're a woman," Daniel said. And his voice had that quality she recognized, the genuine, uncomplicated certainty of a man who believed the thing he was saying was simply a fact about the world, not an argument. "This is not Elias," Ruth said. Elias came out of the house. He stood beside Ruth on the porch, and he did the thing he had done in her kitchen. When the bishop and the elders came, he occupied the space completely without aggression and without performance, in the way of a man who doesn't need to threaten because his simple presence is already saying something. Daniel looked at him, recalibrated, looked at Ruth. "This is a legal matter," one of Daniel's men said. "This document was filed without our knowledge," Elias said, "and our lawyer will respond to it." He looked at Daniel. "Your brother gave your niece this land by every intention, if not by document. You know that. So does everyone in this settlement." His voice was quiet and even. "I'm asking you to think carefully about whether you want to stand in front of a judge and tell him otherwise." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I have a right," he said. "You have a claim," Elias said. "That's different." Ruth stepped forward. "Uncle Daniel." She kept her voice even, but she let him see what was in her eyes. Not anger, but something older and steadier than anger, something her father would have recognized. "I worked this farm every day of my life. I sat with my father every night the last 2 years of his illness. I buried him with my own hands, because no one from this community came through the gate." She paused. "You will not take this from me. Not without a fight, I promise you, I am willing to have." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she couldn't entirely read. Something that might have been shame, if he'd been a man with enough self-knowledge to recognize it as such. "We'll see what the judge says," he said finally. He left. Ruth stood on the porch after the wagon was gone, breathing the cold air, and she was shaking, not visibly, barely perceptibly, but Elias was standing close enough that he could feel it. He did not put his arm around her. He did not try to tell her it would be all right. He said, "Good. Let them go to the judge. Adler will be ready." She breathed out. "My father trusted him," she said. "Daniel. He gave him money he needed himself." "I know. He knew what that money cost." "I know, Ruth." She pressed her hands together to stop them shaking. "Write to Adler tonight," she said. "Tell him what happened." "I'll ride into town in the morning," he said. "First thing." She nodded. She went back inside. She did not fall apart. But that night, lying in the dark of her father's house with the wind against the walls and the sound of the farm settling around her, the way it had settled every night of her life, she thought about Daniel's face and the bishop's face and the two women in the dry goods store who had looked through her, and she thought about the specific weight of being a woman in a world full of men who had decided without ever asking what her life was worth. And then she thought about Elias Croft, who had come through a gate he had no reason to enter and stayed for reasons that were becoming less about practicality and more about something she didn't have a name for yet, and who had stood beside her on that porch without being asked, and who had said, "Let them go to the judge," as though the outcome were already decided in their favor. And she thought that there was a certain kind of man who gave you back your own strength by simply refusing to doubt it. She fell asleep thinking about apple trees. The judge's preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 weeks of work and waiting. And Ruth Beiler did not do waiting well, which Elias figured out within the first 4 days, and which he did not comment on except to give her enough to do that the waiting had no room to become paralysis. He was strategic about this. She saw it clearly and said nothing about it because she understood that strategy in the service of her well-being was not condescension, it was consideration, and she was old enough to know the difference. They wrote out the entire history of the farm together, every season, every improvement, every expense she could remember, and Ruth added details that she had not thought of as significant, but that Adler, when Elias rode in to deliver it, said were exactly the kind of evidentiary record that made the difference in these cases. Her neighbor, an older farmer named Clarence Hopper, who ran a property 2 miles east and had no connection to the settlement, came by one afternoon and told Ruth that he had witnessed Joseph Beiler say in the context of a conversation about the Hoppers' own succession plan that the Beiler farm would pass to Ruth because she was the only one who had ever cared to work it. Ruth stared at him. "You'd swear to that," she said. Hopper looked at her with the particular expression of an old man who has been watching something unfair happen from a distance and finally decided he'd seen enough of it. "I'm an old man," he said. "I got nothing to lose, and I knew your father 30 years. Yes, I'd swear to it." She shook his hand. She held it a beat longer than was strictly necessary, because she could not trust her voice in that moment. Elias, who had been in the barn, came out in time to hear the end of it. He and Hopper talked for 20 minutes, and Ruth stood in the yard and listened to the two of them. The old farmer and the quiet cowboy who had ridden through her gate 6 weeks ago, talking about her father's land, as though its worth were obvious, as though her right to it were obvious, as though the answer to every question being asked about Ruth Beiler's future was obvious. And it occurred to her, standing there in the February cold, that she had spent her entire life being told she was invisible, and that somewhere in the last 6 weeks she had stopped believing it. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. She thought about Elias's hands on the shovel, the way he had said, "Nobody buries their father alone," the way he had sat across from her in her kitchen and said, "I heard you the first time," with the particular patience of a man who was actually listening. She thought about the morning she had laughed in the barn doorway and the brief gone before she could name it thing that had moved in his face when she did. Old Hopper shook Elias's hand and walked back to his wagon, and Elias came across the yard toward Ruth, and the look on his face was the look it always was, direct, unreadable on the surface, with something steady underneath. "Adler says Hopper's testimony could be decisive," Elias said. "I know," Ruth said. He stopped a few feet from her. The February wind moved between them. "You doing all right?" he asked. She looked at him. The honest answer was complicated. She was furious and exhausted and grieving and more determined than she had ever been, and more afraid of hoping for things than she had ever admitted to herself. And underneath all of that, in a place she was not entirely ready to examine, she was aware of him in a way she had never been aware of another person, not as a rescuer, not as a partner in the practical sense they had agreed on, but as himself, as Elias Croft, specifically, as the man who told her about apple trees and held her hand one moment longer than a handshake required, and had never once looked at her the way every other man had looked at her. "I'm doing fine," she said. He nodded. She held his gaze for 2 heartbeats longer than she needed to, and then she looked away back at the farm, at the fence posts on the north field, and the barn roof, and the grave where her father rested under the frozen ground. All of it hers. All of it still here. She was not going to lose it. "We should get the account squared before supper," she said. "Already started," he said. And they went back inside. The hearing was 6 weeks out, and Ruth worked those 6 weeks the way she worked everything completely without complaint, with the focused intensity of someone who knows that the alternative to working is thinking. And thinking right now held too many things she wasn't ready to sit with. Elias matched her pace without comment. That was one of the things she was learning about him. He did not require explanation. He read the room the way a man reads weather, with the instinct of someone who has spent enough time outdoors to know that understanding your environment is not optional. When Ruth was working through something, he worked. When she needed silence, he was silent. When she came to the table with the accounts at 9 in the evening because she couldn't sleep, he came and sat across from her and looked at the numbers with her, and he never once said anything about the hour or the dark circles under her eyes. She was learning him the way you learn a new piece of land carefully, with attention noting what held water and what didn't. What she found was this: Elias Croft did not say anything he did not mean. He did not offer reassurance unless he believed it. He did not pretend things were fine when they weren't, and he did not catastrophize when they were. He had the particular emotional economy of a man who had lost something important and decided on the other side of it to be precise about what things were worth. She respected that. She more than respected it. She recognized it the way you recognize something in another person that you thought only lived in yourself. The morning of the hearing arrived on a Thursday in late March. Ruth wore her good dress again and her mother's collar. Elias wore the clean shirt and his one good coat and had trimmed his beard that morning, which she noticed without saying anything about it. They rode into town in the wagon, with Thomas Adler's office as their first stop, and the county courthouse as their second, and old Clarence Hopper meeting them there at 10 o'clock, as agreed. Adler met them on the courthouse steps. "Daniel Beiler has added a second witness," Adler said without preamble. He had the look of a lawyer who has been surprised by something he should have anticipated and is professionally displeased about it. "A man named Reuben Mast, Elder Mast's son. He's claiming he was present at the same conversation Hopper witnessed, the one about succession, and that Joseph Beiler's meaning was different from what Hopper will testify." Ruth went very still. "He's lying," she said. "I believe you," Adler said. "That doesn't resolve the problem." "What does Reuben Mast say my father meant?" That the reference to Ruth was contextual, that Joseph was speaking about who managed the farm day to day, not who would inherit it. Adler's expression was careful. "It's a plausible interpretation if the judge hasn't formed an impression of your father's character." "Then we make sure he has," Elias said. Adler looked at him. "Do you have something?" "Ruth," Elias said. She looked at him. "Your father's Bible," he said. "You told me he wrote the children's birthdays on the inside cover, and his wife's death, and notes." "He did," she said slowly. "He couldn't write much, but he wrote the important things." What did he write about the farm? Ruth thought back. She had read that Bible 100 times in her life. She knew every mark in it. "In the back," she said. "There are notes in the back. He wrote a list once. I always thought it was just a list of tasks. He wrote Ruth the animals, the accounts, the planting schedule. And under it he wrote—" She stopped. "What did he write?" Adler said. "He wrote, 'This is her place.'" She looked at Adler. 4 words, in Pennsylvania Dutch. "Deze is ihre Sache," which means this is her place, this is her thing, her inheritance. Adler's expression shifted. "You have the Bible. It's at the farm." Adler looked at his watch, looked at Elias. "How fast can you ride?" Elias made it back to the farm and back to the courthouse in 47 minutes, which required pushing Gideon harder than he liked, and which Gideon would make him aware of for the next 3 days in the form of a deeply reproachful attitude at feeding time. He came through the courthouse doors with Joseph Beiler's Bible in his hand, and his coat still moving with the speed he'd come in at, and he found Ruth in the hallway outside the hearing room, where she had been waiting with her hands folded and her face composed, with the particular composure of a woman who has been holding herself together by will for so long that the holding has become its own kind of strength. He gave her the Bible. She took it, held it for a moment with both hands. Then she looked up at him, And something in her face did what it almost never did. It went briefly unguarded, briefly open, briefly. Just Ruth, without any of the careful management she kept around herself. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She squared her shoulders and went in. The hearing room was a plain room. Long table, 6 chairs, a county judge named Harriman, who was perhaps 65, and had the expression of a man who had heard every kind of story people told about property and didn't find any of them surprising anymore. Daniel Beiler was at one end of the table with his 2 men and young Ruben Mast, who was 22 years old and had the look of someone who had been told what to say and was trying to remember all of it. Ruth sat across from them with Adler beside her and Elias behind her and Clarence Hopper at the end. Judge Harriman looked at everyone. "I've reviewed the filings," he said. "We're going to proceed simply. Mr. Adler will present his client's claim. Then we'll hear from the witnesses. I'll ask questions as I see fit." He looked over his spectacles. "Nobody is going to make speeches. Understood?" Everyone said yes or nodded, including Daniel, whose jaw was tight with the effort of it. What happened next moved faster than Ruth had expected, and also much slower 2 speeds simultaneously, the way important things move when you are in the middle of them. Adler presented the case cleanly. The deed, the duration of Ruth's management of the property, the financial records she had compiled, the 12 years she had run the farm's daily operations while her father's health declined. He spoke for 8 minutes. He was precise and without drama, which was Ruth understood the right approach with Judge Harriman. Daniel's man spoke. He cited the settlement's laws, which Harriman listened to with the patience of a man who has heard this argument before and has a settled opinion about it, and then he said quietly, "The settlement's laws are not the laws of this state. Continue." Daniel's man sat down. Hopper testified. He was 81 years old and had no patience for ceremony and said exactly what he had told Ruth he would say, that Joseph Beiler in the fall of 1877 had said plainly that his farm would go to Ruth because she was the only one who had ever put the work in, and that he, Clarence Hopper, had been standing 3 feet away when he said it, and his hearing was fine, thank you. Then Ruben Mast testified. He was 22 and nervous, and his voice was steady, but his hands were not, and he said what he had clearly been prepared to say, that he had also been present, that the conversation had been about management responsibilities rather than inheritance, that Brother Joseph had never used the word inherit, or the word pass, or any specific language of that kind. Harriman listened. Then he said, "Mr. Mast, how old were you in the fall of 1877? Ruben blinked. 19, sir. And what were you doing on the Hopper property in the fall of 1877? Ruben opened his mouth, closed it. "I visiting?" "Visiting who?" The Hopper family." Harriman looked at Hopper. "Mr. Hopper, did you have this young man visiting your property in the fall of 1877? Hopper did not even pause. "Never seen him in my life before today." The room went very quiet. Ruben Mast's face went red. Daniel Beiler looked at his hands. Harriman took off his spectacles and polished them with a slow, deliberate care that managed to communicate an enormous amount without saying anything. Then he put them back on. "Mrs. Croft," he said, "I understand you have a document." Ruth placed the Bible on the table and opened it to the back pages. She had marked it that morning without knowing she would need it today. Marked it because she looked at it every morning. Had since her father died, the way you keep looking at something you're afraid of losing. She pushed it across to Harriman. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the words in Pennsylvania Dutch, and then he looked at Adler, who gave him the translation, and then he looked at Ruth. "This is her place," he said. "Yes, sir." "Your father wrote this." "Yes, sir. I can bring 3 people from the settlement who watched him write it if it's required." He wasn't a man who wrote things down easily. When he wrote something, it was because he meant it to stay. Harriman looked at Daniel Beiler. Daniel said nothing. "I'm going to tell you what I see," Harriman said. He folded his hands. "I see a woman who has run this property for over a decade. I see financial records that are better organized than most county filings I receive. I see a witness who knew the deceased for 30 years. and I see a man who has submitted a witness who was apparently not present at the event he claims to have witnessed." He paused. "I also see a Bible with 4 words in it that are about as clear an expression of intent as I am likely to find in a case without a formal will." He looked at Daniel. "Your claim is not supported by the evidence before me," he said. "This property belongs to Ruth Croft née Beiler as the lawful heir of Joseph Beiler. The settlement's counterclaim is not recognized under state law." He stood. "We're done here." He walked out. The room was silent for 5 full seconds. Then Ruth became aware that she was gripping the edge of the table and made herself let go. She heard Elias exhale behind her. Not a sound he would have made if he'd known she could hear it. A private sound. The kind of sound that escapes a person when something they were more worried about than they showed turns out all right. She wanted to turn around and look at him. She didn't. She looked at Daniel Beiler instead. Daniel sat for a moment. Then he stood. He looked at Ruth across the table, and she waited to feel triumphant or vindicated, or any of the large, clean emotions she had expected to feel in this moment. What she felt instead was tired and sad and old, in a way that had nothing to do with her age. She felt the specific sadness of watching a man who had known her since birth, and had still chosen the shape of greed over the shape of family, and she did not hate him for it, which surprised her. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her. "He gave you money twice," she said. "You could have just let it be." Daniel's jaw worked. He looked like he was going to say something. Then he put on his hat and walked out. His 2 men followed. Reuben Mast followed last, and he did not look at Ruth, and she did not call him back. Adler shook her hand. "Well done," he said. "The Bible was decisive. I should have thought to ask about it earlier." "You couldn't have known," Ruth said. "Your husband rode fast," Adler said with the slight smile of a man noting a fact he finds privately satisfying. "He did," she said. She turned around. Elias was already there. Had been there the whole time, standing 1 step back from the table, the way he always stood present without crowding available, without insisting. He was looking at her, and his expression was doing the thing it sometimes did now, where she could see past the surface of it to something that was not quite readable, but was clearly there, clearly something. "Farm's still yours," he said. "Farm's still mine," she said. She picked up her father's Bible from the table and held it against her chest. And then, because she was Ruth Beiler, and she had been holding herself together for 3 months, and she was in a courthouse hallway in Lancaster County with her whole life just handed back to her, she pressed her lips together and breathed very carefully through her nose until the feeling passed. Elias waited. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. The same thing he always said. And somehow it was always the right thing. Hopper clapped Elias on the shoulder on the way out and said, "Your wife's got more spine than 10 men I know," and walked out without waiting for a response, which was very Hopper. Elias watched him go. Then he looked at Ruth. "He's not wrong," he said. Ruth laughed. Short and surprised the way her laughs came now suddenly like something breaking through. "You've been saying things like that to me for 3 months. I've been meaning them for 3 months." She looked at him. He held her gaze steady as always, direct as always, and she thought not for the first time that there was something almost painful about being looked at like that, about being seen that completely. She had spent her whole life being looked past, and she had made peace with it, and now here was this man who did not look past her, who had never once looked past her from the moment he came through her gate. And it turned out that being seen was not comfortable at all. It was terrifying, and it was wonderful, and she did not entirely know what to do with either of those things. "We should go home," she said. "Yes," he said. They went home. The settlement's response came 9 days later, and it came not as a legal document, but as a social one, which was the only weapon left to them, and the one they knew how to use most effectively. Bishop Stoltzfus made the shunning formal. He announced it at the Sunday service that Ruth was no longer permitted to attend, and the word went out through the settlement with the particular speed of community news reaching farmhouses and dry goods exchanges, and the mill where grain was brought in by Friday morning. Ruth heard about it from old Hopper, who had it from a Mennonite family who traded at the same mill. "Figured you should know," Hopper said. He was standing on her porch, turning his hat in his hands, with the discomfort of a man delivering information he wishes wasn't his to deliver. "Some folks are saying they won't trade with you, not just the settlement. Others, too, who don't want the settlement's trouble." Ruth nodded. "How many?" "3 farms I know of who said it directly. Could be more." He looked at her steadily. "You'll lose the grain contract with the millers. They buy for 4 families. That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." After Hopper left, she sat at the kitchen table with her paper and her pencil, and she worked the numbers. The grain contract wasn't nothing. The grain contract was 16% of the farm's income. 16% was not fatal on its own, but it required adjustments, and adjustments required decisions, and decisions required her to think clearly instead of the way she was currently thinking, which was with a cold fury she was keeping very carefully contained. Elias came in from the field to find her at the table and read the situation in approximately 4 seconds. He sat down. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it, the shunning announcement, the grain contract, Hopper's estimate of how far it might spread. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How much does the grain contract cover?" 16%. "And without it, we survive, tightly." She looked at the numbers. "If we lose more than that, we don't." He looked at the paper, turned it toward him slightly. She watched his eyes move over the numbers. He was not as fast as she was with figures, but he was careful, and careful got there. "We need a new buyer," he said. "I know." "Hopper would know who trades out of county." "I already thought of Hopper." "Of course you did." He looked at her. "What else?" She put down the pencil. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them. Her hands that had driven a shovel into frozen ground, that had carried her father's pine box, that had compiled financial records and written out the history of a farm that was now hers by law, if not yet by peace. "I'm angry," she said. "I know. I did everything right. I won in court. The farm is mine, and they're still—" She stopped. "They can't take the land, but they can make it so no one around here will trade with me, and eventually that does the same work slower." Elias was quiet. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking," he said carefully, "about the ranch in western Pennsylvania." Ruth looked up. 40 miles is too far for the settlement's reach," he said. "New county, new judge district. Nobody there knows anything about Amish community politics or Lancaster disputes." He held her gaze. "The land is good. You've known that since I described it. And you have a legal document now that proves who you are and what you can do." She understood what he was saying. She had understood it for a while, she realized, had understood it in the way that you understand something before you're ready to admit that you understand it. "I would have to leave this farm," she said. "You would." "My father is buried here." "He is." She looked at the table. "He's not the farm," Elias said quietly. "He's in the ground behind the house. That goes where you go, Ruth. That's not a place. That's inside you." Something cracked in her chest, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "I know that," she said. "I know you know it." She sat with it for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around them. The same kitchen where her father had drunk his coffee every morning, where her mother had hung herbs from the ceiling beam that Ruth had never taken down, where she had sat at 11 years old, doing sums by firelight, while her father read aloud from the Bible. "If we go," she said finally, "I want to come back twice a year, spring and fall, to tend the grave." "Yes," Elias said, without hesitation. "Of course. And I want to sell the farm, not give it to Daniel, not let the settlement have it. Sell it to someone who will work it and take that money and put it into the ranch." "That's exactly right," he said. She looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "I've been thinking about it longer than tonight," he said. "How long?" He considered. Since the hearing. When I rode back with the Bible. He paused. I rode past 3 farms on the way, all of them showing signs of settlement ownership the particular way they keep their fences, the outbuildings. And I thought that this county is going to be hard for you in a way that has nothing to do with law and everything to do with who's lived here longest and how they talk about you. He looked at her directly. You won the legal fight, Ruth. You might not win the social one, and you deserve to be somewhere people don't already have an opinion about you. She stared at him. You thought all of that on the ride? I think fast on horseback. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she looked at the kitchen ceiling and breathed and thought about her father and her mother and the collar and the apple trees and the 40 acres with the creek along the west edge that she had never seen but that she knew the shape of, now the way she knew the shape of things that mattered. Show me the deed, she said. What? The ranch deed. You have it with your papers. Show me. He went and got it. He spread it on the table, and she looked at it for a long time, the legal language, the acreage, the water rights, the location. Margaret wanted apple trees on the west edge, she said. She did. Then we'll plant them. He looked at her. That's her plan, he said carefully. You don't have to. It's a good plan, Ruth said. A good plan doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to whoever's willing to do the work. She looked at him. She had sense. I'd have liked her, I think. He was quiet for a long time. She would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who made themselves smaller than they were. She would have found you extremely satisfying. Ruth held his gaze. Something had been moving in the room between them for weeks. She had felt it, and she had been careful with it the way you are careful with something fragile that you haven't yet determined how strong it actually is. But sitting here tonight in her father's kitchen, with the ranch deed on the table, and the decision made, and the long hard winter of the last 3 months settling into something that was starting to look like the beginning of something else, rather than simply the end of everything, she said, Elias. Ruth, I want to say something, and I want you to tell me plainly if I'm wrong. All right. I did not marry you because I needed to, she said. I mean, I did, but that's not why I said yes. She looked at him steadily. I said yes because you came through that gate, because you looked at me the way you look at me, because you sat at this table and told me true things and didn't say any of the things people usually say to me. She paused. I want you to know that. His expression shifted, that movement gone before it could be read, that she had been cataloging for 3 months. Except this time it stayed a moment longer. This time she could see what it was. I know it, he said. His voice was different by 1 register lower, more careful the voice he used when he was saying something that cost him something. And I want you to know. He stopped. Started again. When I said it could become something. With time. He held her gaze. It already has. For me. Some time ago. Ruth's breath went quiet. She had been told things by men before. Not many times, and not by men she respected, but she had heard the kinds of things men said, and she had learned to hear the space between the words and what the words actually meant, and she had stopped trusting the space a long time ago. She trusted this. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers the same way he had the morning they agreed to marry, warm and steady, except that this time there was nothing practical about it. This time it was just 2 people in a kitchen, deciding together that the thing between them was real. Well, she said after a moment. Well, he agreed. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. They sat like that for a while with the ranch deed on the table, and her father's Bible beside it, and the fire going down to coals, and outside the window. The Pennsylvania winter was starting very slowly to think about becoming spring. They listed the farm with Adler's help 2 weeks later. The buyer came faster than expected, a young couple from Ohio Mennonite background, but no connection to the Lancaster settlement, who had been looking for established farmland in the county, and who looked at the property with the eyes of people who saw what it was, rather than what had happened in it. The wife walked the north field with Ruth and asked good questions about the soil. The husband looked at the barn roof Elias's repair from January and nodded. They made an offer on a Thursday. Ruth and Elias accepted on a Friday. The settlement heard about it by Saturday. Bishop Stoltzfus appeared at the door one final time, and he had with him an offer slightly lower than the Ohio couple's, but an offer from a settlement family who wanted the property kept within the community. Ruth opened the door. She looked at him. "I've already accepted an offer," she said. "Ruth, the family is from Ohio," she said. "They work hard, and they'll work this land well. My father would approve." She paused. "I am done having this conversation with you, Bishop." Stoltzfus looked at her for a long time. She could see him assembling the thing he wanted to say, the argument he had prepared, the appeal to community and God, and the people she had grown up with, and then something shifted in his face. Something that was not quite recognition, but was in the same neighborhood. He looked at her, and he seemed to see her, perhaps for the first time, not as a category of problem to be managed, but as a woman who had made her decision and was not going to be moved by anything he brought to this porch. He put on his hat. "God keep you," he said quietly. Ruth considered him. "And you," she said. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway and breathed once, and then she went to find Elias to tell him they needed to start packing, because the closing was in 3 weeks, and the ranch in western Pennsylvania was not going to ready itself. She found him in the barn with Persistent, who was leaning against his shoulder, in the way she had taken to doing over the last 2 months, in the way of horses who have decided they belong to someone new. "We're packing," Ruth said. Elias looked at her. Stoltzfus, gone. He looked at her face, reading it the way he read everything, with that particular attention that she had stopped finding unsettling, and started finding instead something she did not have a single word for, but that she understood was important. "You all right?" he said. She thought about the question. The real answer. Not? "I'm fine," the answer she had given her whole life. The answer that meant, "I am managing, and I do not need anything," but the real answer. The answer that living with Elias Croft for 3 months had slowly made possible. "I'm sad," she said. "And I'm ready. Both." He nodded. "Both makes sense," he said. She came into the barn and stood beside him, and Persistent immediately leaned toward her too, in the way she always did, and Ruth put her hand on the mare's neck and felt the warmth of her, the solid animal realness of her. And she looked out the barn door at the farm. The fence posts Elias had fixed, the north field, the grave with the wooden marker she had made herself, the sky going orange over the roof of the house her father had built with his own hands. She let herself feel all of it. She did not look away from any of it. Then she breathed in and let it go, the way you let go of things that are finished, with grief and gratitude in the same breath. "We should start with the kitchen," she said. "My mother's things, those go first." "Tell me what to carry," Elias said, and they went in. The wagon was packed in 2 days. Ruth did not pack sentiment. She packed tools, seed stock, her mother's kitchen things, the accounts ledger, the Bible, the collar, and the practical contents of a farm that had been running for 30 years. She left the furniture, most of it was her father's, and too heavy for the road, and the Ohio couple had asked about it, and she had said they could have it as part of the sale, and she meant that simply, without the grief she expected to feel, and instead felt as a kind of clean release, like setting down something very heavy and discovering your hands still worked. Elias loaded without commentary and without asking whether she was sure about any of it, which was the correct approach, and which she appreciated the way she appreciated most things. He did quietly, and more than she said. The morning they left, she went to the grave alone. She stood there for a long time without speaking, and then she said low and private the things she would have said to her father if he had been standing in front of her, that she was sorry for the will. He never wrote that she was not sorry for the man she'd married, that she thought the Ohio couple would work the land the way it deserved, that she was going west to plant apple trees. that she was going to be all right. She pressed her hand against the wooden marker once. Then she walked back to the wagon. Elias was holding Gideon's lead and waiting, and he looked at her once when she came back. That look, that specific, direct, unhurried look that she had come to understand, meant "I see you, whatever you need," and said nothing, and helped her up onto the wagon seat. They were out of Lancaster County by noon. The first thing she noticed about the ranch was the silence. Not the absence of sound. There was wind in the creek she could hear before she could see it, and persistent moving in the back of the wagon with her particular opinions about long travel. But the silence of a place that had not been occupied in a while. The silence of a house that had been waiting. She understood waiting. She understood it better than almost anything. The house itself was smaller than the Beiler farmhouse, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, stone foundation, the kind of construction that meant someone had built it to last rather than to impress. The barn was in better shape than the house. The south pasture was overgrown, but the soil when she got down and picked up a handful was dark and rich and meant things. The creek ran clear along the western edge exactly where Elias had described it, and the old oaks he'd mentioned stood there like they had been standing since before either of them was born and intended to keep standing after. "Margaret chose well," Ruth said. Elias was standing beside her, looking at the south pasture. Something in his posture was different here, looser, she thought, and then revised that to more itself, the way a man stands in a place he has a history with. "She did," he said. "She always chose well." "How long since you've been here?" 2 years. He paused. "Maybe a little more." She looked at the house, at the work ahead of it. "We should start on the roof first, before rain. The back wall of this barn needs attention too. After the roof." He looked at her sideways. "You haven't even been inside yet." "I don't need to be inside to see the roof," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She had been collecting those sounds for 3 months. The almost laughs, the almost smiles, the things that escaped him without his full permission, and she found she valued each one more than the last. The first month was work without pause. The kind of work that asks nothing from you but your body and your attention, and repays you with exhaustion so complete that thought becomes impossible. And Ruth had always done her best. Living inside that kind of work had always found it clarifying the way other people found prayer. Clarifying, which made sense, because her father had always said they were the same thing. She fixed the roof with Elias beside her, both of them up there in the March cold, and she discovered that he was methodical in his repairs, the way she was methodical in her accounts. Careful, exacting, unwilling to leave something half done, and this was satisfying to her in a way she didn't try to analyze. They met their nearest neighbor on the 4th day. His name was George Aldrich. He was perhaps 50, a widower himself, who farmed 200 acres to the north, and who appeared at their fence line one morning with 2 bottles of good cider and the specific energy of a man who has been curious about the newcomers since the wagon appeared and has decided that bringing cider is a sufficient excuse for satisfying that curiosity. He was friendly, uncomplicated. He looked at Ruth the way people who live in open country often look at strangers, with assessment that was practical rather than judgmental. The look that asks, "Are you capable and honest?" rather than "Do you fit the shape I expected?" "You farm?" he asked Ruth directly. "All my life," she said. "What do you know?" "Soil management, animal husbandry, accounts, supply, logistics, planting schedules." She paused. "I'm learning Western Pennsylvania weather. It's different from Lancaster." Aldrich looked at Elias. "Where'd you find her?" "She found me," Elias said. Aldrich looked back at Ruth with an expression of someone revising upward. "Well," he said, "you need anything, you know where I am." That was all. That was the entire evaluation. No whispers, no averted eyes, no calculation about what she looked like running behind every expression. Just a man with cider wanting to know if his new neighbors were worth knowing. Ruth accepted a bottle of cider and thought that this was what it felt like to be somewhere new. To be only what you actually were to the people in front of you, with no history preceding you and no story already decided. She had not known until now how heavy that history had been. But the trouble came anyway. It always did. In Ruth's experience, trouble did not ask permission, and it did not wait for convenient timing. It arrived at the moment when you had just started to breathe. It arrived in April in the form of a man named Gerald Potts. Potts owned the property directly to the south of the ranch, 160 acres. Good grazing land, which he had been farming profitably for 15 years. He was perhaps 55, heavy in the way that suggested he had once been strong and had decided he no longer needed to be, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from being the largest landowner in a small area for long enough that you stop distinguishing between your preferences and the law. He arrived on a Wednesday morning when Elias was in the far field checking fence line, and Ruth was in the yard with the accounts sitting on the porch step because the April sun had finally turned warm enough to make outside possible. Potts rode in without announcing himself, which was a thing some men did when they wanted to establish early that they did not consider your convenience particularly relevant. He looked at Ruth on the porch step. "Croft here," he said. "He's in the field." She put down her pencil. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Potts?" "Gerald Potts. I own the south property." He looked at her with the assessment she recognized now, the quick downward measure. He was not subtle about it. "You the wife?" "Ruth Croft," she said. "Right." He looked at the accounts on her knee. "Doing the books?" "Yes. My wife used to do the books," he said with the tone of a man who finds this charming in retrospect, but would have found it inconvenient in practice. "Left me to a daughter in Ohio. Good woman." He looked around the yard. "Place has been sitting empty 2 years. Lot of work ahead." "We know," Ruth said. "Croft planning to run cattle?" "Some. Crop farming primary." Potts nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means the person is thinking something they haven't said yet. "There's a water issue I need to discuss with him, the creek that runs along your western edge." Ruth went still, very slightly. She kept her face even. "What about it?" she said. "The previous arrangement before Croft stopped working the place was that I had drawing rights from the creek during dry months, July and August primarily. The ranch wasn't running those months, wasn't using the water, so Croft's wife and I worked out an informal agreement." He paused. "I'd like to continue that." "What kind of agreement?" Ruth said. "Drawing rights. My men come through twice a week, pull water for the south pasture livestock. Through our property. Through the western edge. It's not far out of the way." Ruth looked at the creek in the distance, at the south pasture they were planning, at the apple trees she and Elias had decided would go along the western edge by that same water. "I'll discuss it with my husband," she said, "when he's back from the field." Potts looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "The arrangement's been in place 8 years, and it was informal," Ruth said, "which means it can be revisited." She held his gaze. "I'll discuss it with my husband." Potts left. Ruth sat on the porch step and looked at the western edge of the property for a long time. Then she opened the accounts ledger and wrote in the margin, "Water rights south property investigate." She underlined it twice. Elias heard the whole thing without interruption when he came back. Then he said, "There's no written agreement." "I know. Margaret never mentioned it to me." His jaw was set in the way it got when he was working through something that made him angry carefully before deciding what to do with the anger. If she had an arrangement with Potts, she would have written it in the house accounts. She wrote everything. "Where are the house accounts?" "Box in the loft." They found them that evening. Margaret Croft's account books, 3 of them covering the years 1869 through 1872, written in a hand that was precise and small and very certain. Ruth sat with them at the kitchen table and read through them with the focused attention she gave everything important, while Elias made coffee and did not hover because he had learned by now that she worked better without hovering. There was no mention of Gerald Potts. There was no mention of water agreements. There was no mention of drawing rights of any kind. There was, however, in the July entries of 1871, a note that read, "Potts asked again about the creek. Told E, we should not agree. He will push if given an inch." Ruth looked up from the book. Margaret knew him, she said. Elias looked at the entry. Something moved across his face, something that was grief and recognition, and a quiet fury simultaneously, which was a particular combination she was beginning to recognize in him when the past and the present collided in a way he hadn't prepared for. "She never told me," he asked, he said. "She handled it herself." Ruth looked at the entry again. "He will push if given an inch." She was right, and she never gave the inch. "He waited until the ranch was empty," Elias said. 2 years. Watched and waited, and then came in when we arrived and claimed an arrangement that never existed. "Yes. Because he thought I was the one here alone," Ruth said flatly, "and that a woman doing the accounts on the porch step would be easier to manage than whoever he expected you to be." She placed her hand over Margaret's neat, precise entry. "He miscalculated," she said. Potts came back on a Friday, and this time Elias was in the yard. Ruth was also in the yard. She had made sure of that. Potts pulled his horse up and looked at Elias with the adjusted approach of a man recalibrating for a different audience. "Croft," he said. "Potts," Elias said. "Your wife tells me she talked to you about the water arrangement." "She did." Elias's hands were easy at his sides, his voice completely level. "We looked through the house accounts. There's no record of any agreement. It was informal." "Margaret kept records of everything," Elias said. "There's a note from 1871 where you asked and she said no." Potts's expression shifted. "That was a long time ago," he said. "The situation's changed. The ranch was empty 2 years. "The ranch was empty," Elias said. "Not abandoned. The deed is mine. The water rights are in the deed." He looked at Potts steadily. "There's no arrangement. There never was one. You don't have drawing rights on our creek. I run 160 acres, Potts said, and his voice had sharpened now the pleasantness gone. "I've been here 15 years. I have relationships in this county that go back before you were a working concern." The implication was clear and deliberate. "I'd think carefully about what kind of neighbor you want to be." Ruth stepped forward. She did not plan it. She simply did it the way you move toward something when your body has decided before your mind has caught up. She stood beside Elias, and she looked at Gerald Potts, and she used the voice she had used in the Beiler farmhouse kitchen with Bishop Stoltzfus and Uncle Daniel and all the men who had stood in her spaces and tried to make them smaller. "Mr. Potts," she said, "we have your name and this conversation in writing as of this morning, along with the account entry from 1871. If you bring a legal claim, we will bring those documents." She held his gaze. "You have relationships in this county. So does George Aldrich. And we have had coffee with George Aldrich 6 times in the last month, and he has been very generous with information about how business is conducted around here." Potts looked at her. He looked at her the way men looked at her when they had made an assumption, and discovered it was wrong with a recalibration that was almost visible, a shifting of weight, a narrowing of the eyes, that meant the calculation was starting over. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Croft?" he said. "It's a description of our position," she said. "I want to be clear about it so there's no misunderstanding later." Potts looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him with the calm expression of a man who is not going to say what he thinks of someone directly, but whose silence is communicating it entirely. Potts turned his horse around. "We'll see how the summer goes," he said, and rode out. The yard was quiet. Elias looked at Ruth. "Aldrich," he said. 6 times. 5, she said. I rounded up for emphasis. His mouth moved, that almost smile. "You're remarkable," he said. She felt it in her chest, the particular warmth of being seen clearly, and found more than sufficient. She breathed through it. "He's going to try something else," she said. "That's not done." "I know." He was already thinking past the immediate victory. "What do you think he'll do? He can't take the water legally, so he'll work socially. Same pattern as the settlement. If he can make us look like difficult neighbors, make people wary of us, that does the work without the lawsuit." She looked toward the south property. "He'll start with whoever trades in the closest market town. Aldrich will hear it when he does. That's why Aldrich matters. She turned back to Elias. We need to be visible before Potts talks. We need people in that market to know us before he tells them who to think we are. Elias looked at her. Market Saturday, he said. I know, she said. They went to the Saturday market with 3 things: 2 dozen eggs, a jar of Ruth's preserved summer vegetables from the Lancaster stores she'd brought west, and her full attention, which was the most valuable thing she brought anywhere. She talked to people, the way her father had taught her, directly, without performance, asking about their land and their season, and listening to the answers with genuine interest. Because she had always found other people's practical knowledge interesting, and genuine interest was something people recognized and responded to. By the end of the first hour, she had spoken to 7 farmers. By the end of the second, she had a standing egg order with the owner of the market stall. A conversation with a woman named Clara Hewitt, whose family ran a dry goods operation in the nearest town, and the beginnings of a reputation as someone competent and straightforward, which was exactly the reputation she needed to exist before Potts began constructing a different one. Elias watched her work, not managing, not intervening, watching with the particular attention he gave things he found worth watching. On the ride home he said, "You've done this before." Survived people who wanted to manage my reputation before I could establish it. She looked at the road. Yes, my whole life. You're very good at it. I shouldn't have to be, she said simply. But I am. He was quiet for a moment. I want to say something. Say it. When I rode into that Lancaster farm in January, he said, I thought I was doing a decent thing, a simple thing. A stranger needed help, and I was there. He paused. I did not expect... He stopped, tried again. I had stopped expecting things, after Margaret. I thought that was peace. I thought not expecting anything was the same as being all right. Ruth listened without looking at him. I was wrong about that, he said. And I want you to know that I know I was wrong about it. He looked at the road. What you are, Ruth, is I don't have a single word for it. I have looked for the word, and I don't have it. But I want you to know that whatever it is, it has changed things. For me. In ways I didn't think I had left in me. The wagon moved along the road. The April air was warming by degrees. There was a smell of turned earth and distant water, and the specific freshness of a season arriving. Ruth reached over and covered his hand on the reins with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers the same way he always did, warm and steady and certain. Apple trees, she said after a while. What about them? When do we plant? He thought about it. May. 6 weeks. Then we have 6 weeks to get the western fence repaired well enough to protect them. That's a lot of fence. Good thing there are 2 of us, she said. He squeezed her hand. She did not let go. The twist came from a direction neither of them had looked. It came on a Tuesday evening when Aldrich rode in late and fast, and Aldrich was not a man who rode fast unless there was reason, and there was reason. He pulled up at the barn, and Elias came out, and Ruth came to the door, and Aldrich said without getting down from his horse, There's a land claim filed in the county office, filed 2 days ago, against this property. Everything went very still. By Potts, Elias said, not Potts. Aldrich looked at Ruth, and something in his face said he was sorry for what he was about to say. By a man named Samuel Croft, says he's your husband's brother. Says Elias Croft transferred the property to him in 1873 and never legally reclaimed it. Ruth looked at Elias. Elias had gone completely motionless. Not the kind of still that meant calm. The kind of still that meant something had hit him that he hadn't seen coming, and his body was deciding what to do with it. Samuel, he said. The word came out flat, stripped of everything. You have a brother, Ruth said. A long pause. I did, Elias said. I haven't spoken to him in 9 years. Aldrich looked between them. I'm sorry, he said. I thought you should hear it from me. Yes, Elias said. Thank you, George. Aldrich rode out, Ruth and Elias stood in the yard in the April evening, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than their usual one, not the comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill space, but the taut silence of something that has been waiting to surface. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the ground. Then he seemed to decide something. "Come inside," he said. He told her at the kitchen table, the same way she told him things directly without decoration, the way he had always spoken, and which she had come to understand was not coldness, but was instead the particular honesty of someone who believes that the truth deserves to be said plainly. Samuel Croft was 3 years younger. They had come west together from Ohio in their 20s, both of them young and hard-working and ambitious in the way that only people who have grown up without money are ambitious. They had bought the ranch together, pooled what they had split. The deed worked the land side by side for 2 years. Then, Elias had met Margaret, had married her, had started to build the ranch into something beyond just surviving. And Samuel had wanted his half out. He didn't want a farm, Elias said. He wanted the money from the land. He thought we could split the proceeds, go different ways. His voice was flat and even in the way it got when he was talking about things that cost him. I didn't want to sell. Margaret didn't want to sell. The ranch was just starting to be what we'd intended it to be. He paused. I bought him out. What I had plus a note for the rest. He signed his half over to me in 1872. He looked at the table. Margaret died that summer. He stopped. I was not paying attention to anything for a while. I paid Samuel slowly. Too slowly. He got impatient. Another pause. We argued. He left. I paid the last of it in 1874 and sent the payment west. He'd gone to Kansas, and I never heard back from him. Ruth looked at him. Is the transfer documented? She said. It should be in the county records, filed in 1872. And the final payment? I have the receipt. It's in the deed box. She breathed out. Then the claim is false. The claim is false, he said, but it has to be answered, and it will cost us time and money we don't have going into planting season. He looked at her. And I don't know why he's done it now, after 9 years. Something moved in his face. Unless someone told him the ranch was active again. Ruth thought about that. Pots, she said. Elias's jaw tightened. He could have found Samuel without much trouble. Kansas isn't that far if you're motivated. He couldn't get the water rights legally, she said, so he found a way to cloud the deed instead. She felt the familiar cold fury moving in her chest, the fury she had been living with since January, the fury at men who could not simply take no and accept it. He thought that would be enough to drive us off. He thought wrong, Elias said. Yes, she said. He thought very wrong. She stood up. She went to the deed box that lived on the top shelf in the corner, the one she had found their first week here, and had already looked through twice, because she looked through important documents, the way other people checked locks regularly, thoroughly, making sure everything was where it should be. She found the transfer document from 1872. She found the payment receipt from 1874. She laid them both on the table. Then she got the account ledger and opened it to a new page. We need to write to Adler, she said. Tonight. Lancaster's too far. Not Adler personally, but he'll know someone in this county. He always knows someone. She looked at Elias. This is Potts. We need to prove it's Potts. That's what ends this cleanly. How? Samuel Croft went to Kansas in 1873, and you had no contact with him for 9 years, until 2 weeks after Potts came to this yard, and you turned him away. She held Elias's gaze. That's a timeline. That's a story. Any judge who sees that timeline and then looks at our documentation is going to understand exactly what this is. Elias looked at her across the table. The documents between them. The ledger opened to a new page. The lamp burning low. You see it that fast, he said. It wasn't a question. I see patterns, she said. I always have. My father used to say I could find a problem's shape in the dark. She looked down at the paper. This one's not even dark. She picked up her pencil. "Talk to me," she said. "Tell me everything you remember about Samuel. Everything about 1872. Everything about the payments. I'm going to write it all down in order, and tomorrow we're going to town, and we're going to find out who Potts has been talking to, and then we're going to make sure everyone who matters understands exactly what's happening here." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Ruth," he said. She looked up. "My brother walking into this," he said quietly. "After 9 years. It's—" He stopped. She could see him deciding how much to say, which was a thing he still did, sometimes still calibrated the habit of a man who spent 7 years keeping things inside. "It's not just a legal problem. Samuel and I know," she said. She held his gaze. "We'll handle the legal part first. The rest, whatever you need to do with the rest, I'm here for that too." He breathed in. She waited. "He wasn't a bad man," Elias said finally. "When we were young, he wanted things faster than the land would give them. And when Margaret died, I think he felt guilty that we'd argued, and the guilt made him stay away, and the staying away made the guilt worse, and 9 years of that." He shook his head. "I don't know what he is now." "Then we'll find out," she said simply. He looked at her. "You're not afraid of any of it," he said. "I am," she said. "I'm afraid of losing this place. I'm afraid of starting over again. I'm afraid of what it would do to you to lose this land twice." She met his eyes. "But afraid doesn't mean stopped. It just means you do it anyway." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers on the pencil. "I'm glad," he said, "that Gideon went the long way home in January." She looked at their hands. She thought about frozen ground and a pine box and a gate standing open. "So am I," she said. Then she turned her hand over and held his for exactly as long as she needed to. And then she straightened the page and said, "Start from the beginning." And Elias began to talk, and she wrote down everything. Ruth wrote until the lamp burned low and the kitchen went cold, and when she finally set down her pencil, the page was full. 2 sides tight, and ordered the entire history of Elias's ownership of the ranch laid out in sequence with dates and amounts, and the names of every person who had been present for any part of it. She looked at what she had written. Then she looked at Elias, who had been talking for 2 hours, and who was now sitting with his coffee gone cold, and his hands wrapped around the empty cup, looking at the wall with the particular expression of a man who has excavated something he had buried, and is deciding whether the excavation was worth it. "Samuel wasn't at the funeral," Elias said. He hadn't said this earlier. It came out now at the end, the way the real things often come out at the end. "Margaret's funeral. We'd argued 3 weeks before. He didn't come." A pause. "I told myself it didn't matter. She was gone, and what did it matter who came and who didn't?" He looked at the cup in his hands. It mattered. Ruth did not offer comfort in the way of words that softened edges. She had learned that Elias did not want his edges softened. He wanted them acknowledged. "Yes," she said, "it mattered." He breathed out. "I paid him the last of what I owed him because I wanted him gone," he said. "Not because I thought it would close things between us cleanly. I just wanted—" He stopped. "I didn't want to think about him and feel that particular thing anymore." What particular thing? He thought about it. The feeling that if I'd sold the ranch when he asked, maybe he would have been there. And if he'd been there, maybe I don't know. Maybe the grief would have been something I carried with someone instead of alone. He looked at her. "That is not a rational feeling." "It doesn't need to be rational," she said. "It just needs to be true." He was quiet. "It's true," he said. She folded the pages she had written, careful and precise. "Then here is what else is true. You have documentation that proves the transfer was complete and paid in full. You have a clear timeline that puts Samuel's claim arriving 9 years later and 2 weeks after Potts was turned away from this property." She looked at him. "And you have me, and I have no patience whatsoever for men who use other people's grief as a tool." She held his gaze. "We are going to town tomorrow. We are going to find a lawyer and file a response. And then we are going to find out whether Samuel Croft came here on his own trouble or on someone else's instruction." Elias looked at her for a long moment. On his own trouble or someone else's instruction, he repeated. Yes. You think there's a difference? I think it matters enormously for what we do next, she said. If Potts paid him or promised him something, Samuel is a tool. If Samuel came on his own, he is something else. What? A man in enough pain to do something foolish after 9 years of silence. She paused. Which is still wrong, but it's differently wrong. Elias set down the empty cup. You think in very clear lines, he said. I had to learn to, she said. When you grow up in a community that makes decisions about your life without consulting you, you learn to see exactly where every line is, who drew it, what it's actually protecting. She looked at the folded pages. Potts drew a line around that water. Your brother drew a line around his guilt. Bishop Stoltzfus drew a line around what a woman was allowed to be. She looked up. I have been stepping over lines my whole life. I am not afraid of one more. He stood up. He came around the table, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, direct and complete. And then he did something he had not done before. He put his hand against her face, his palm warm against her cheek, his thumb at the edge of her jaw, and he held it there and looked at her and said, I need you to know something. She waited. I have not been a man who needed much, he said. I made myself that way on purpose, after Margaret. I decided that needing things was the same as being vulnerable to losing them. He paused. I was wrong about that too. His thumb moved slightly. I need you, Ruth. Not in the way of someone who can't manage alone. In the way of someone who has discovered that managing alone is a much lesser thing than I convinced myself it was. Her throat tightened. She let it. Elias, she said. I know it's not what we agreed to at the start, he said. I know we said practical. I know we said, Elias, she said again, and put her hand over his at her cheek. It stopped being practical for me some time ago, too. He looked at her. Some time ago, she said. I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between you writing for the Bible and you standing on my porch while Bishop Stoltzfus told me I'd chosen the world. She held his gaze. I didn't choose the world. I chose this. He kissed her then, quietly, the way he did everything without performance, without drama completely. And she kissed him back with all the careful feeling she had been carrying for 4 months and had not had the right words for until now. When they separated, he pressed his forehead against hers. Still going to town tomorrow, she said. He laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded the first time she had heard it that complete, and it was the best sound she had encountered in a very long time. Yes, he said. Still going to town tomorrow. The lawyer in the nearest county town was named Harriet Burke, which surprised Elias considerably and did not surprise Ruth at all, because Ruth had been finding competent women in unexpected positions her entire life and had simply learned to expect them. Burke was perhaps 45, with sharp eyes and the organized desk of someone who was very busy and had made peace with it. She read through Ruth's pages in 6 minutes. She asked 4 questions. Then she looked up. The transfer document from 1872 is clean, she said. The payment receipt from 1874 closes the note entirely. Samuel Croft has no legal standing. She paused. The question is whether he knows that, or whether someone told him he did. That's what I want to determine, Ruth said. Burke looked at her with the appraising look of a professional encountering someone competent in a different field and recognizing it. You compiled this documentation. Yes. You have a legal background. Farm management, Ruth said. But records are records. Burke's mouth moved slightly. She looked at Elias. Where did you find her? She found me, he said. Same answer as Aldrich, which Ruth noted and which pleased her more than she would say. Burke filed the response that afternoon. Clean and fast, citing the transfer document and the payment receipt, and requesting that the county produce any evidence Samuel Croft had that superseded those documents. She also, on Ruth's suggestion, sent a formal letter to the county sheriff, noting the timeline, Samuel's claim arriving 2 weeks after Potts had been refused water rights on the property, and requesting that the sheriff be aware of the pattern. "The sheriff's a reasonable man," Burke said. "He doesn't like Potts much. Nobody does particularly, but nobody's had clean cause before." "We're not giving him cause," Ruth said. "We're giving him a timeline." "Which is enough," Burke said, "for a reasonable man." They were 3 days waiting for a response, and Ruth spent those 3 days doing what she always did. With waiting, she worked. She and Elias repaired the western fence, while the days were still cool enough for hard labor. Working side by side in the comfortable rhythm they had developed over 4 months, the rhythm of two people who had stopped needing to negotiate space and had simply learned the shape of each other. It was on the second day mid-morning, both of them working on the fence line along the creek, that they heard hoofbeats coming in from the south. Ruth straightened and looked. The man coming along the fence line was not Potts. He was younger, mid-30s, perhaps lean in a way that suggested he had been lean for a while, dressed in clothes that had been good once and had been worn too long. He rode a bay horse that was tired around the eyes. He pulled up at the fence. He looked at Elias. Elias had gone very still. "Samuel," he said. Samuel Croft looked at his brother across the fence line, and he looked like what he was, a man who had made a decision he didn't fully understand and had ridden a long way to stand in the consequences of it, and who was not finding it comfortable now that he was here. He looked at Ruth. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Croft," she said. He looked back at Elias. "I didn't file that claim," he said. "I want you to know that first." Ruth felt Elias tighten beside her, and then deliberately release it the way he managed things. "Then who did?" Elias said. "A man named Potts. Came to me in Salina 6 weeks ago. Said you'd sold him water rights before you left the ranch, and then came back and denied it. Said you'd swindled him." Samuel's jaw worked. "Said I was still co-owner because the note was never properly discharged, and if I filed a claim I'd get half the value of the property." "The note was discharged in 1874, Elias said. "I know that." Samuel looked at the fence. "I knew it when I said yes. I just—" He stopped. "I was angry. I've been angry for a long time." He looked up. "Not about the money. The money was fine. About Margaret's funeral," Elias said. Samuel flinched. One quick movement gone. "Yeah." "You should have come," Elias said. "I know. She deserved better than that." "I know." Samuel's voice was rough. "I was ashamed, and the longer I stayed away the worse the shame got, and the easier it was to stay angry instead." He looked at Elias directly now with the particular courage of someone who has ridden a long way to say something difficult. "Potts offered me money, and I wanted to punish you, and I said yes. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong." He paused. "I went to the county office 2 days ago and withdrew the claim." Silence. Ruth looked at the document in her apron pocket. Burke's response, which they had been carrying for 2 days. She did not take it out. Elias looked at his brother for a long time. She could not see his face from her angle, but she knew the expression. She could read it by the set of his shoulders and the quality of the silence coming off him. "You rode from Salina to tell me that," Elias said. "Yes." "That's 3 days." 4. Took the north route. Another silence. "You're thin," Elias said. Samuel blinked. "What?" "You're too thin. You look like you've been eating poorly." Samuel stared at him. "I just told you I filed a fraudulent land claim against you." "I know what you told me." Elias opened the fence gate. "Come in. Ruth will make coffee." Samuel did not move for a moment. He looked at his brother standing in the open gate, and he had the expression of a man who had prepared for a very different kind of reception and does not know what to do with the one he is getting. He looked at Ruth. She looked back at him steadily. "There's bread too," she said, "if you're hungry." Samuel dismounted. He was hungry. He ate 2 slices of bread and drank 2 cups of coffee and told them everything about Potts. The approach in Salina, The offer the letter Potts had written with the county deed number already filled in the specific and detailed story Potts had constructed about Elias swindling him on water rights. He'd done his research, Samuel said. He knew dates. He knew amounts. He knew about Margaret. He looked at his hands. He used her. He said Elias had been unstable after her death and had made agreements he didn't remember making. His voice tightened. I let him use her because I wanted to. Ruth looked at him. Did Potts pay you? He offered. I didn't take it. I don't. Samuel looked at the table. I didn't want his money. I wanted. He stopped. You wanted to matter, Ruth said. He looked at her. To be something in this story, she said, after 9 years of being nothing in it. His jaw moved. That's a hard thing to say to someone. It's a true thing, she said. I'm not saying it to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters whether Potts paid you or whether he just found the place where you already hurt and pushed. She held his gaze. If it's the second one, then Potts is the problem. And you being here and telling us what he did makes you part of the solution. Samuel looked at Elias. Elias was looking at Ruth. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was beyond the steady, direct attention she had catalogued over 4 months. Something that was open in a way that was almost startling on a face that was usually so composed. Something that was uncomplicated and enormous and entirely clear. He loved her. She could see it. She could see it as plainly as she had ever seen anything. She looked back at the table because she needed a moment. Potts, she said, keeping her voice even. You're willing to say in front of a judge what you just told us? Yes, Samuel said, including the letter he wrote with the deed number. I still have the letter. Ruth looked at Elias. He had come back to himself. She could see the shift, the composure returning. But the thing she had seen was still there underneath it, and she thought it would always be there now that she had seen it. Harriet Burke, she said. Tomorrow morning, he said. I'll send word tonight. Gerald Potts was summoned to the county courthouse on a Thursday in late April. He arrived with a lawyer and the confidence of a man who has calculated that this will resolve in his favor, and he sat across the table from Elias and Ruth and Burke and Samuel Croft, with an expression that shifted progressively and visibly as the evidence was laid out. The transfer document from 1872. The payment receipt from 1874. Ruth's timeline. Samuel's testimony and the letter in Potts's own hand. The county sheriff, who had come as an observer and who had the expression of someone whose low opinion of a specific man is being thoroughly confirmed. Potts's lawyer spoke for 12 minutes and then stopped because there was nothing more useful to say. Potts looked at Samuel with an expression of someone who has used a tool and watched it turn. Samuel looked back at him without flinching. Burke presented the full case in 9 minutes. She was precise and without sentiment, the way Ruth had been without sentiment in front of Judge Harriman in Lancaster, because sentiment was not the language courts spoke, and both women understood that. The county judge, a man named Foster, 50 years old, with the expression of someone who has seen enough property disputes to find them personally offensive when they are obviously manufactured, looked at the letter in Potts's handwriting, looked at the timeline, looked at Samuel Croft sitting across from the man who had recruited him to commit fraud. Mr. Potts, he said, do you have anything to add? Potts said nothing. The land claim is dismissed with prejudice, Foster said. The Croft property title is confirmed without encumbrance. He looked at Potts over his spectacles. The matter of fraudulent inducement for the purposes of a false claim is something the sheriff will determine how to pursue. He stood. We're done. The sheriff put his hand on Potts's shoulder before Potts reached the door. Ruth watched this and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a pattern close the pattern of a man who had spent years pushing until he found someone who pushed back and discovering that someone had. Outside the courthouse, Burke shook their hands and said with the understatement of a professional who has learned to contain her satisfactions, "That was a well-documented case, Mrs. Croft." "Thank you for your work on it," Ruth said. Come back if there's more trouble." "There won't be," Ruth said. Burke smiled. "You sound very certain." "I am," Ruth said. Samuel stood apart from all of this in the way of someone who is not sure whether they are welcome in the aftermath they helped create. Elias went to him. Ruth watched from a slight distance, giving them the space that was theirs. Watching Elias walk up to his brother, and the two of them stand there in front of the courthouse in the April morning, with 9 years of silence between them that had to go somewhere, and watching Samuel say something she couldn't hear, and watching Elias listen with his head slightly bent, the listening posture she knew by now, the posture that meant he was taking something in, all the way to where it mattered. Then Elias put his hand on the back of his brother's neck, the way older brothers do, with a rough and wordless affection that requires no translation, and Samuel closed his eyes for just a moment. Then they separated and walked back to Ruth. "He doesn't have anywhere he needs to be in Salina," Elias said. Ruth looked at Samuel. "Can you work?" Samuel blinked. "Ma'am, the fence on the western edge needs finishing," she said. "The south pasture is going to need clearing before we can plant. We're putting apple trees along the creek, and that's 2 weeks of work for 2 people, and considerably less for 3. She looked at him. "Can you work?" Samuel looked at his brother. Elias looked back at him with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was everything a smile was. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said slowly. "I can work." "Good," she said. "You'll sleep in the barn until we figure out the loft situation. Elias will show you where things are." She looked at both of them. "We're losing the morning. Let's go." She walked to the wagon. Behind her, she heard Samuel say to Elias, low and genuine, "Where on earth did you find her?" And she heard Elias say, "She found me." And she heard the warmth in it this time, not just the fact, but the feeling underneath. The warmth of a man who knows exactly what he has and holds it carefully. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins and waited for both of them. And when they climbed up beside her, she clicked Gideon into motion, and they drove home in the April morning, all 3 of them, toward the ranch and the fence that needed finishing, and the soil that was waiting. The apple trees went in on a Saturday in early May. Ruth had ordered them through Aldrich, who knew a nurseryman in the next county who had good stock, and they arrived on a Wednesday. 12 young trees, bare-rooted, packed in wet burlap, and spent 3 days heeled into the barn, while Ruth and Elias and Samuel finished clearing the western fence line and worked the soil along the creek edge until it was ready. Saturday morning, all 3 of them planted. It was the kind of work Ruth loved best. Work with a long result work, whose payoff you could not see yet, but would work, that required attention and care, and the knowledge that what you put into the ground today was a commitment to still being here when it bore fruit. She had always been comfortable with that kind of patience. She had been built for it. She thought built for the long work, the deferred return, the tending of things that took time. She was on her knees in the soil with the 4th tree when she heard Elias stop digging. She looked up. He was looking at the western edge of the property, at the line of young trees going in along the creek, at the water moving clear and cold behind them, at the old oaks standing their watch on either side. He had the expression of someone looking at something they had imagined for a long time, and are seeing now for the first time made real. She would have loved this, he said. Quiet. To no one in particular, or to everyone at once. Samuel, 2 trees down, looked at his brother. He was quiet for a moment. She would have ordered twice as many, he said. She always overcalculated on trees. Elias made a sound that was both laugh and something older than laugh. She did, he said. They went back to digging. Ruth pressed the soil around the 4th tree's roots and felt something she did not try to name. Something that was the particular feeling of being in the right place, which she had not felt since before her father died, which she had not been sure she would feel again. She was in it now. In it completely. That evening, the 4 of them, Ruth and Elias and Samuel and Aldrich, who had come to see the trees and stayed for supper, because Aldrich always stayed for supper, when the invitation was available, sat at the kitchen table in the long May light, and Ruth made biscuits from her mother's recipe, And Elias made the coffee, and Samuel set the table with the particular care of a man who is trying to earn his place in a household, and knows it. And they ate and talked about the south pasture and the summer planting, and what Aldrich knew about the nearest grain market, and what kind of cattle Elias was planning to bring in by fall. It was a plain conversation, a working conversation. The kind of conversation that people who are building something have, because building things requires constant planning, and planning requires constant talking. And there was nothing in it that was remarkable, except that it was in fact remarkable in the way that ordinary good things are remarkable when you understand clearly how they might have not existed. Ruth looked around the table at some point and understood this. She understood it the way she had understood the farm accounts clearly, with full knowledge of what was in the credit column and what was in the debt column and what the balance actually meant. The credit column, a ranch that was hers, a husband who looked at her like she was worth looking at, a brother-in-law who was going to be all right with time and work, a neighbor who brought cider and stayed for supper and meant it when he said, "Come to me if you need anything." The debt column, everything she had lost to get here, which was real and remained real, which she did not need to minimize to also hold the credit. The balance was good. The balance was better than good. After supper, after Aldrich had gone and Samuel had gone to the barn, Ruth and Elias sat on the porch in the evening air, and she felt the day settling around her the way good days settle slowly, with the satisfaction of something completed and something begun simultaneously. "The trees looked right," she said. "They did." 6 years before they bear," she said. "Maybe 5 if the soil does what I think it will." "You'll be here in 5 years," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I will." He was quiet for a moment. The evening was full of its sounds, insects in the creek and the horses in the barn. "Ruth," he said. I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He was not a man who fumbled. She had learned that. He was deliberate and clear and said what he meant. But he was looking at her now with something that was as close to uncertain as she had seen on him, and she found it not frightening, found it dear. "We married practically," he said. "And then it became something else. And I know that. You know that." He held her gaze. "But I want to ask you again, with nothing practical about it, nothing that needs to be done or fixed or fought for." He paused. "I want to ask you whether you will stay, not because of the ranch or the law or any of it, because of me, because of what this is." Ruth looked at him. She thought about frozen ground and a gate and a man who had no reason to come through it and came through it anyway. She thought about a pine box and a Bible and a kitchen table and a courthouse and a wagon drive in January and the feeling of his hand turning over to hold hers. She thought about apple trees and Margaret's plans and Samuel saying she would have ordered twice as many, and the look on Elias's face when she said it stopped being practical for me some time ago. She thought about her father who had said wait for the first kind, the kind of man who sees what's in front of him and who had been right, who had always been right about the things that mattered. "Elias Croft," she said. "I have been staying since January. I intend to keep staying for the remainder of my life." She held his gaze. "You are the first person outside my father who has ever looked at me and seen exactly what was there without editing it into something more comfortable for yourself." She paused. "I do not intend to let go of that. Ever." He reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he always held it, warm and steady and certain. And this time neither of them said anything else for a long time, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and they both understood that. Yet, in the years that followed, the Croft Ranch became known in that county for 3 things. The first was the apple orchard along the Western Creek, which produced fruit so good that people drove considerable distances for it beginning in the 5th year, which was exactly when Ruth had predicted, because the soil had done what she thought it would. The second was Ruth Croft herself, who was known as a woman you went to when you had a problem that required clear thinking and no patience for foolishness, and who had helped 4 neighboring families navigate legal and financial difficulties over the years with the same direct, organized intelligence she had brought to her own. The third was the simple fact of the ranch itself, what it was and how it ran, and the way people felt when they were in it, the way visitors noted that it had the quality of a place where two people had decided to be exactly where they were and had meant it every day since. Samuel stayed. He turned out to be good with cattle, better than Elias had expected, which Elias told him, and which Samuel received with the expression of a man who had gone a long time without anyone telling him he was good at something. He built a small house on the north edge of the property in his second year, and it sat there beside the fence line like a fact, like something that had always been meant to be there. Gerald Potts faced a fraud charge that the county sheriff pursued with the particular satisfaction of a man with a long grudge finally given the right paperwork. The charge did not ruin him, but it reduced him, which was, Ruth thought, the appropriate outcome, not destruction, but consequence. The specific shape of a man discovering that his assumptions about what he could take without cost had been wrong. Ruth went back to Lancaster County twice a year, as she had promised herself she would spring and fall, to tend her father's grave, to leave flowers. Her mother had liked to stand for a while in the place where she had started, and let herself know that the distance between there and here was real, and was hers, and had been worth every mile. The last time she went, in the fall of her third year on the ranch, she stopped at the edge of the Beiler property and looked at it from the road. The Ohio couple had painted the fence. There was a new addition on the north side of the barn. There were children's voices somewhere beyond the gate. She sat in the wagon for a moment and let herself feel it, the grief that lived specifically in that place, and nowhere else. The grief of her father and her mother, and the community that had made her invisible, and the life she might have lived if she had been different, or they had been different, or the world had been built on kinder principles. She felt it fully. Then she let it settle back into the place inside her where it lived, the place that would always be there, and that she no longer needed to be afraid of, because grief that has been fully felt is a thing you carry rather than a thing that carries you. She clicked Gideon into motion. She drove back to Elias. She drove home. On a November evening in the fourth year, they sat by the fire after supper, and the house was warm, and outside the orchard stood bare and waiting for spring. And Elias was reading, and Ruth was looking at the account ledger, which showed a balance that would have been unthinkable 4 years ago. And she set it down and looked at the fire for a moment. "Elias," she said. He looked up from his book. "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. He was still the same man he had been in January of that first year, direct, composed, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided to be exactly what he is, and has no plans to be anything else. But there was warmth in it now, warmth that had been there from the beginning, in the way warmth is sometimes there before the person it belongs to admits to it. She held his gaze. "By spring," she said quietly, "there will be 3 of us." He went very still. The way he went still when something had reached him at the deepest level. Not the processing stillness, not the patient waiting stillness, but the stillness of someone struck by something they had stopped hoping for. "Ruth," he said. His voice came out different by half a register. "Yes," she said. He set down the book. He crossed to where she was sitting, and he crouched in front of her, and he took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with everything he was, everything he had been keeping careful all his life, and she looked back at him with the same. "3 of us," he said. "To start with," she said. He pressed his forehead to her hands. Stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed, and something moving through him that was not a thing she needed to name or explain, or give language to, because some things are their own language, whole and sufficient. Then he looked up. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you?" "I'm healthy, and I'm well, and I am more than all right," she said. "I need you to know that first." "I know it," he said. "I believe you." He breathed in. He shook his head. The almost smile had become a full one, real and unhurried and entirely unguarded. "I didn't think I'd have this again." "Neither did I," she said. "I'd stopped imagining it." He stood up and pulled her to her feet and held his arms around her with the careful warmth of a man holding something that matters enormously, and knows it. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the particular safety of him. Not the safety of someone who would protect her from the world, but the safety of someone who had looked at her fully and chosen to stay, which was the only safety she had ever wanted or needed. Outside, the November dark was settled and complete, and the orchard waited in it, and the creek ran cold and steady along the western edge. And in the spring, there would be apple blossoms and new calves and the sound of children. And all of it was real, and all of it was theirs. Not because the world had given it to them, but because they had looked at each other across a kitchen table in the worst winter of both their lives and decided that what they were together was worth building. A woman who had been left to dig alone. A man who had come through the gate. And everything that grew from that.